Beneath the shroud of mist that clings to Mount Parnassus, a lone figure climbs the jagged path toward the ruins of a forgotten temple. The air is heavy, the kind that seems to hum with memory. Each step stirs the silence of centuries. The stones beneath his sandals are slick with dew, and the mountain wind carries a faint scent of ash and laurel. Above, the clouds twist and fracture around a pale moon, and for a heartbeat, it feels as though the entire mountain is breathing. The pilgrim stops, steadies himself, and looks up toward the shadows of the columns that crown the ridge. This is Delphi, once called the navel of the world. Here, the ancients believed, the voice of a god once spoke through a mortal woman. Tonight, the mountain feels alive again. In the distance, thunder rolls, echoing off cliffs that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The air tastes metallic, like the edge of lightning. The pilgrim descends a narrow stairway carved into the rock, his torch flickering wildly against the wind. Below, a cavern yawns open, its mouth choked with darkness. Inside, a faint vapor curls from a crack in the stone floor, like smoke from a dying fire. He kneels, pressing a hand to the ground, and the warmth surprises him. From deep within the mountain comes a subtle hiss, a whisper that could almost be a voice. It is said that this fissure once opened directly into the breath of the earth, that from here Apollo spoke through his chosen mouthpiece, the Oracle of Delphi. The pilgrim listens, but all he hears is the murmur of wind and time. And yet, the deeper he breathes, the stranger he feels. The edges of the world begin to blur. The scene fades, and the narrator's voice enters, calm but charged with awe. For more than 1,000 years, this place held the most feared and sacred voice in the ancient world. Kings, conquerors, philosophers, and poets journeyed from every corner of the known earth to kneel before a single woman seated above this fissure. A woman who could speak the language of gods. Her words changed destinies, crowned rulers, and doomed empires. And yet, no one truly understood where her power came from. Was she a vessel of divinity, or the first great manipulator of human belief? The torchlight catches the faint carvings on the wall, serpents entwined, laurel wreaths, and the single word once inscribed over the temple gate, Know thyself, know thyself. It was a commandment to every pilgrim who entered, a warning as much as wisdom. To know oneself, to truly confront what lies within, was to risk hearing something one could never unhear. Many came to Delphi seeking certainty. Few left unchanged. Some claimed the oracle's words were riddles of salvation. Others swore they were curses spoken in honeyed tones. But all agreed on one thing. Once you heard the voice, you could never doubt again that there were forces beyond comprehension. The pilgrim's torch gutters out, and for a moment he stands in total darkness. The air is warm and faintly sweet, carrying an aroma that soothes and terrifies at once. The ancients called it the breath of the god. In that darkness, he imagines the Pythia, the high priestess of Apollo, seated upon her tripod, her eyes rolled back, her body trembling as the vapor fills her lungs. Around her, priests would stand ready to transcribe her utterances, weaving her gasping words into poetry, riddles, or commands. Sometimes she spoke in clear tones, other times only in fragments, like dreams escaping a fever. What she said could alter the course of nations. And yet, she was only a woman, frail, human, and mortal. The camera lingers on the fissure, smoke curling upward like a ghost. We imagine her voice, distant, musical, and terrifyingly sure. The mighty will fall. The meek shall inherit dust. Beware the gift that glitters. History would record these words, and centuries later, scholars would still argue whether they were divine truth or human craft. How could a woman who knew nothing of warfare foresee the fall of kings? How could she predict storms, deaths, or betrayals days before they happened? Perhaps she didn't. Perhaps those who came to her, desperate, fearful, greedy, brought their own answers in their hearts, and the oracle merely mirrored what they already knew. Outside, the storm breaks over the mountain. Rain lashes the stones where the temple once stood, washing over broken marble and the faint outline of what was once the sacred omphalos, the stone that marked the center of the world. In the flash of lightning, The pilgrim sees it clearly. A serpent carved into its surface, coiled around the ancient mark of Apollo. He realizes the irony, that in the place where humans once claimed to hear the divine, there is only silence now. But that silence hums, as though beneath it something still stirs. The narrator's tone deepens. The Oracle of Delphi was not merely a priestess. She was the intersection between myth and reality, between faith and fear. The Greeks believed she could speak directly with the god Apollo, the bringer of light, music, and prophecy. But Apollo was also the god of plague, madness, and vengeance. To seek his wisdom was to risk his wrath. Yet, generation after generation, people came. They crossed oceans and deserts, climbed this mountain, offered gold and blood and tears, all for a few trembling words from the lips of a woman seated in smoke. Why? Because in her voice, they believed, was the power to pierce the veil of fate itself. As the storm fades, dawn begins to glow behind the clouds. The pilgrim steps from the cave, soaked and shivering, but changed. He looks down into the valley, where the ruins of Delphi stretch like the bones of a sleeping titan. Somewhere below, the ancient theater still holds its semicircle of stone seats, once filled with thousands who came to witness sacred drama, reenactments of the god's triumph, his rage, his prophecies. The past feels close enough to touch. He whispers a prayer he doesn't fully believe, a plea for clarity in a world still ruled by uncertainty. The narrator's voice returns, softer now, almost mournful. In every age, humanity has sought a voice that could tell us what we cannot bear to decide ourselves, whether in gods, stars, or numbers. The Oracle of Delphi was that voice for over 1,000 years. Yet her greatest secret was not what she revealed, but what she concealed. The power of belief itself, the invisible current that can make empires rise or crumble, flowed through her chamber like the breath of the earth. And perhaps, in the end, that was her true prophecy. Not a vision of tomorrow, but a mirror held up to the human soul. The pilgrim turns away, the wind tugging at his cloak. Behind him, the mountain exhales one final wisp of vapor into the morning light. For an instant, it almost sounds like words, a whisper too faint to understand, yet impossibly familiar. The camera lingers on the rising smoke as the narrator asks the question that will carry through the rest of the story. What if the Oracle of Delphi knew something we were never meant to hear? The temple rises from the stone like something half-born of the mountain itself, its columns glimmering gold beneath the light of dawn. From afar it looks eternal, serene, silent, absolute. But inside, the air is thick with sound. The murmurs of supplicants, the shuffle of sandals across marble, the steady rhythm of breath from those who have waited days, even weeks, for a single audience. The smoke of burning bay leaves drifts upward in slow spirals, mingling with incense and sweat. Laurel, honey, and fear. That is the scent of Delphi. And beneath it all, faint but constant, the hum of the earth itself, as though the mountain is alive and listening. The pilgrims stand at the outer gate first, clutching small tokens. A coin, a carved image of Apollo, sometimes a lock of hair. Each gift is an offering, a currency of faith. They wash in the sacred spring of Castalia, water so cold it shocks the heart into stillness. The priests watch them from the shadows, silent figures draped in white. They know who will be permitted to enter and who will not. To seek Apollo's wisdom is not a right. It is a privilege purchased with devotion, or gold, or both. Some say the oracle could see the truth in a man's eyes the moment he crossed the threshold. Others whispered that she saw only what she was told to see. Inside, the great hall is dimly lit by oil lamps that tremble with every breath of wind. The walls are lined with the spoils of belief, golden tripods, silver cups, ivory figurines of gods and heroes. Each one tells a story of someone who came before. Kings who sought victory, merchants who begged for safe passage, lovers who asked if their passion would last the year. The pilgrims' prayers echo in this chamber of smoke and marble, swallowed by the murmuring priests who record nothing but remember everything. They are the unseen scribes of destiny. At the center of the temple stands the Adyton, the inner sanctum, forbidden to all but the Pythia and the priests. A stone stairway leads down into it, narrow and uneven. From below rises a faint hiss, like breath escaping the lungs of the earth. The pilgrims know that sound. It is said to be the voice of Apollo himself, murmuring through the chasm that splits the rock. They wait in silence as the priests descend, carrying torches whose flames bend strangely in the vaporous air. Then she appears, the Oracle, the Pythia. She is no queen or goddess, though she might as well be. Her hair is bound in a crown of laurel leaves, her skin pale beneath the flicker of firelight. Her eyes, half-lidded, seem to see everything and nothing at once. She walks barefoot across the cold stone, her steps unhurried, almost floating. The priests lead her to the tripod, a bronze seat placed directly above the fissure. Beneath her, the sacred smoke rises, swirling around her feet like ghosts seeking warmth. The crowd outside the chamber kneels as her breathing deepens. Her lips tremble. The ceremony begins. The priests chant in low tones, invoking Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy. Their voices weave together, ancient syllables heavy with rhythm and meaning. The Pythia inhales, exhales, and inhales again, the vapor filling her lungs until her body begins to sway. Some say she is entering a trance. Others say she is being entered, possessed by the god himself. Her voice, when it comes, is nothing human. It is sharp, melodic, and trembling all at once. Words spill from her like water over stone, fragments of phrases that make no sense at first and yet feel charged with hidden meaning. The priests lean in, their styluses ready. They do not record her words verbatim. No, that would be too crude. Instead, they shape them, polish them, translate them into something that sounds divine. By the time the message reaches the petitioner, it has passed through several hands, each smoothing its rough edges, each adding the faintest glimmer of ambiguity. The god has spoken, they say, and the people believe them, because to doubt the oracle is to doubt Apollo himself. The pilgrim from before stands among the others, his heart pounding in his chest. When his turn comes, he steps forward, eyes lowered. He kneels before the priest, who asks his name, his homeland, and his question. The man hesitates, his voice barely a whisper. "Will my son live through the winter?" The priest nods once and turns to the oracle, repeating the question in ritual form. The Pythia stirs. Her eyes flutter, and for a moment, the air seems to thicken around her. The vapor rises higher, curling around her hands. Her mouth opens, and a sound emerges, soft at first, then louder, faster, almost frantic. The priests listen, interpret, and after a long moment, the lead priest steps forward. The god says, he intones, "The roots that endure the frost shall blossom in spring." The pilgrim exhales in relief. He does not ask for clarity. He does not dare. To question a prophecy is to invite the god's displeasure. He bows low, places his offering on the altar, and leaves with tears in his eyes. Behind him, the oracle continues to speak, her body trembling, her voice echoing through the stone halls like a melody from another world. Outside, the line of supplicants grows longer. Farmers, soldiers, aristocrats, even foreign envoys, all come seeking the same thing: certainty in an uncertain world. For some, the oracle's words will bring peace. For others, destruction. But none will forget the sound of that voice, the one that seems to know the shape of their fears before they do. They call it the voice of Apollo. Yet standing in the temple, watching the ritual unfold, one cannot help but wonder, whose voice is it really? The god's? The woman's? Or the echo of every desperate heart that has ever begged for meaning? As the day wanes, the Pythia's trance begins to fade. Her breathing slows, her hands fall limp at her sides. The priests lift her gently from the tripod, her body slick with sweat, her expression serene. They will tend to her, bathe her in sacred water, and let her sleep. She is both revered and pitied, the vessel through which divinity flows, and the human who bears its cost. Outside, the pilgrims begin their descent down the mountain, their faces lit with hope, confusion, or fear. The temple doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, sealing the secrets within. The narrator's voice softens, contemplative now. Every civilization has its temple, its place where the human and the divine are said to meet. But Delphi was different. Here, the gods did not appear in thunder or flame. They spoke in riddles, half-truths that forced mortals to wrestle with their own desires. The oracle did not hand out destiny like a decree. She revealed it in fragments, in mirrors, in shadows. To stand before her was to stand before oneself. As twilight settles over the mountain, the last of the smoke drifts from the temple roof. The air cools, the marble gleams, and for a moment, the whole world feels suspended between breath and silence. Somewhere beneath the stone, the fissure still exhales, that same strange, sweet vapor that once carried a god's voice. And though centuries have passed, the question remains, eternal and unanswered. Was Apollo truly speaking? Or did humanity simply learn to listen to its own voice through the smoke? Before there was a temple, before the marble steps and the golden offerings, there was only the mountain and the mist, and a whisper that no one could name. The story begins not with men, but with gods and monsters. Long before Apollo claimed Delphi as his sacred home, this place was said to belong to something older, darker, and closer to the raw pulse of the earth. The Greeks called it Python, a great serpent born of the rotting mud left behind after the great flood. It slithered across the mountainside, coiling itself around the navel of the world, guarding a chasm that breathed steam and secrets. From that fissure rose vapors that could drive mortals mad, or gift them visions of impossible clarity. People came to fear it, to worship it, to feed its sacrifices. They built no temple here then, only shrines of stone, cracked and blackened by smoke. Delphi, before Apollo, was not a place of prophecy. It was a place of warning. But in myth, power never remains unchallenged. One day, the sky opened and a god descended. Apollo, radiant, golden-haired, the bringer of music and light, arrived bearing a silver bow and arrows that burned like sunlight. He looked upon the serpent that ruled this place and saw in it the embodiment of chaos, the whispering darkness that defied his order. The battle that followed shook the mountain itself. The serpent's scream split the sky, echoing through the valley for 9 days. Finally, Apollo's arrow struck true, piercing the creature's heart. Its massive body convulsed and sank into the earth, its blood mingling with the stones, its dying breath spilling up through the fissure that would one day be the oracle's seat. From that breath, the ancients said, rose the power of prophecy, a god's triumph over a monster's curse. Where the serpent fell, Apollo built his temple. But the earth does not forget so easily. The fumes that rose from the crack below were not only the god's gift. They were also the serpent's last breath, still whispering in the dark. And so the oracle was born from both divinity and decay, half god's light, half serpent's shadow. This is the paradox at the heart of Delphi, that what was holy was also haunted. Every word spoken by the Pythia carried that tension, between revelation and delirium, between blessing and curse. The ancient poets wrote that Apollo's victory over Python was not just a myth, but a transformation, the taming of wild, chthonic forces into something ordered and sacred. Before Apollo, prophecy belonged to Gaia, the Earth Mother herself. Her priestesses spoke in murmurs and blood, offering sacrifices to the ground. But Apollo, god of reason and measure, claimed that power for himself. The Oracle of Delphi, then, was the moment when the chaos of the earth was forced to speak the language of gods. It was not simply religion. It was civilization itself learning to shape the unknowable into words. Yet even in this divine order, the echoes of the old world remained. Beneath the temple, the fissure breathed, a reminder that the serpent was never truly gone. The priests might have called it the breath of Apollo, but some whispered it was Python's revenge, his soul twisting through the cracks, ensuring that every prophecy was tainted with a hint of uncertainty. And perhaps that was the secret to the oracle's power. Her words were never pure. They carried within them the duality of the world, truth and deceit, creation and destruction, God and monster. As Delphi rose to prominence, myths layered upon myths. Some said the first oracle was not even human but a nymph who wandered too close to the chasm and was consumed by its voice. Others claimed that Apollo himself spoke directly through the laurel trees, their rustling leaves forming the first oracles before the Pythia ever existed. Still others told that the god's sacred tripod was forged from the bones of Python, its 3 legs representing past, present, and future, the 3 tenses of fate that even gods could not escape. The temple became a stage where myth and memory intertwined, where every stone seemed to hum with ancient stories buried deeper than time. In time, people came to call Delphi the Omphalos, the navel of the world. They believed Zeus himself had once sent 2 eagles flying from opposite ends of the earth, and where they met in midair was this place. The stone that marked the spot, the Omphalos, stood at the center of the sanctuary, carved with serpents and draped with cloth. It was said to connect heaven and earth, the living and the dead. Beneath it, the ground pulsed with warmth, the same warmth the pilgrim in our earlier journey felt beneath his hand. To stand there was to feel the heartbeat of creation itself. But not everyone saw Delphi as a gift. Some ancient thinkers, even then, suspected that the oracle's visions came not from gods but from the gases that rose from below. The poet Diodorus spoke of sweet vapors that softened the mind. The philosopher Plutarch, who once served as a priest at Delphi, hinted that the Pythia's ecstasy came from something physical, not spiritual. Yet even he admitted that whatever force dwelled beneath that stone was beyond mortal comprehension. The ancients understood what we sometimes forget, that the sacred and the scientific can coexist, that mystery is not diminished by understanding its form. The oracle's lineage was traced back to this mythic birth, a god's victory carved into the bones of the earth. Every time she entered her trance, it was said that she was reenacting that ancient battle, Apollo descending once more to subdue the serpent's chaos, to bring order from madness, to make meaning out of the void. The smoke that rose from the fissure was both weapon and sacrament. To breathe it was to step into the borderland between life and death, where the human mind could hear what mortals were never meant to know. As centuries passed, the legend of Apollo and Python became more than a story. It became a ritual. Festivals were held each year to honor the god's triumph. Musicians played hymns said to echo the god's bowstring. Dancers reenacted his descent from the heavens. And yet, in every performance, there was an undertone of fear, because to celebrate Apollo's light was to remember the darkness he had conquered. The Greeks knew that every victory demanded a price. And somewhere beneath the temple the serpent still slept. When the pilgrim returns in his dreams, for who could leave Delphi without dreaming of it, he sees that battle playing out again. He stands on the edge of the chasm, the air glowing with heat, the mountain shaking beneath his feet. From below, a voice rises, not one, but 2. One sings of light, the other of shadow. Together they weave a melody that is both beautiful and terrifying, the eternal song of creation itself. He wakes before dawn, the sound still in his ears, unsure whether he has heard the god or the earth. The narrator's voice emerges softly over the vision. Myths are not lies. They are truths disguised as stories. The tale of Apollo and the Python was not meant to explain geology or religion. It was meant to explain us. Our endless struggle between order and chaos, faith and doubt, light and darkness. The oracle was born from that struggle, her every prophecy an echo of the world's oldest battle. Perhaps that is why her words still haunt us. Because somewhere deep down we recognize them as our own. The wind rises again over the mountain, carrying the faint scent of laurel and smoke. The camera drifts over the ruins, the columns, the altar, the broken omphalos stone, and down into the shadows where the fissure still lies. The air shimmers as if alive, a reminder that under every myth is a memory, under every god a mystery, and under every voice a whisper from the earth itself. The same whisper that has been speaking since the serpent first fell silent. They came from every corner of the known world. Kings wrapped in gold, sailors with salt still crusted on their skin, farmers with dirt beneath their nails. The road to Delphi wound through mountains and olive groves, steep and perilous. But no journey was too long when the reward was an answer from the gods. To the ancient Greeks, Delphi was not merely a sanctuary. It was the axis of existence, the point where heaven and earth met, where divine will shaped mortal fate. Here, questions were not just asked, they were weighed, tested, and answered in ways that could build empires or destroy them. At the heart of this great network of faith stood the Oracle, a single woman whose words could tilt the balance of power across the Mediterranean. She was the voice of Apollo, and through her, the gods will flowed like a river through stone. Yet Delphi was never a place of quiet mysticism alone. It was a center of politics, of commerce, of influence so deep it could rival the mightiest throne. To seek the oracle's counsel was to enter a world where belief and ambition intertwined until neither could be told apart. As the centuries passed, Delphi's reputation spread far beyond Greece. The Spartans came to ask whether to go to war. The Athenians came to justify their democracy. Even the mighty Persians, whose armies darkened the horizon, sought to know the gods' favor before battle. Every leader, no matter how powerful, approached the Pythia with reverence and fear. For the oracle did not flatter. She did not choose sides. Her words, it was said, were shaped by the truth of the god, not the desires of men. And yet, history tells us that her answers often favored those who knew how to listen best, or how to pay most generously. The sacred process began long before a petitioner could stand before the oracle herself. A delegation, called a theoria, would journey to Delphi, bearing offerings. Gold tripods, silver bowls, exotic fabrics, even livestock. Upon arrival, they were greeted by priests of Apollo who inspected the gifts, performed purification rituals, and decided when the god would speak. Some were turned away. The god is silent today, they would be told, though rumor had it that silence could always be broken by sufficient tribute. Others were allowed to approach the temple, carrying with them the hopes of their cities. Before entering the sacred chamber, each visitor had to undergo a ritual cleansing in the Castalian spring. The water, icy and pure, symbolized not only physical purity but also the washing away of doubt. They would then offer a sacrifice at the altar, often a goat, and watch the priests examine its entrails for omens. If the signs were favorable, the consultation would proceed. The air around the temple would grow tense, the mountain wind whistling through cypress leaves as if the world itself held its breath. Inside, the Pythia sat upon her tripod above the sacred fissure. Laurel leaves burned in bronze braziers, releasing a sweet smoke that curled around her face. She inhaled deeply, her body swaying, her eyes glazing over. The priests waited in silence until the first tremor of her voice broke through the chamber. A sound like a whisper stretched thin across eternity. The petitioner would state his question. The answer would come in fragments. Sometimes a riddle, sometimes a song. Always ambiguous, always final. To those who received her words, the oracle was absolute. But to those who stood behind her, the priests who interpreted, the temple officials who managed the offerings, the politicians who guarded her reputation, Delphi was a machine of influence as much as it was a house of divinity. Her prophecies could align cities, justify wars, and elevate leaders to godlike status. Athens claimed Apollo's blessing for its expansionist policies. Sparta found divine approval for its martial discipline. Even distant colonies, founded across the seas, carried with them the oracle's sanction written on clay tablets or recited in hymns. Delphi's voice traveled farther than any army, reaching places Apollo's chariot never touched. This power made Delphi not only revered but indispensable. The oracle became a unifying force in a fragmented world of rival city-states. Through her, a shared spiritual identity was born, a Greece bound not by empire, but by faith. Her temple became the center of the Amphictyonic League, a coalition of neighboring states sworn to protect the sanctuary and its treasures. In theory, it was a brotherhood of peace. In practice, it was a political council, where alliances were forged in the name of Apollo. Decisions made within these marble walls rippled outward, shaping the destiny of an entire civilization. And yet, Delphi's authority was never merely political. It was existential. The Greeks believed that the gods were not distant observers but active participants in human life. Capricious, passionate, and sometimes cruel. To live without guidance was to court disaster. The oracle was their compass in a sea of divine chaos. Whether one was a king deciding on war or a farmer choosing when to plant his crops, Apollo's words provided order in a universe of uncertainty. Still, doubt crept in, as it always does. Some began to wonder whether the oracle's wisdom came from the god at all, or whether it was crafted by those who controlled access to her. The priests, after all, were men. Clever, learned, and politically aware. They knew which cities paid tribute, which generals held grudges, which empires were rising and which were about to fall. Could they not shape a prophecy to suit a purpose? If the oracle's words favored one side, who would dare question them? To challenge the god's mouthpiece was to invite blasphemy, and no one wanted the curse of Apollo upon their name. The pilgrims who climbed the mountain rarely thought of such things. For them, the temple was the one place where human fear met divine mercy. To stand before the Pythia was to feel both small and seen, to sense that one's life, however humble, was part of something vast and meaningful. Even those who received grim prophecies often described a strange peace afterward, as if knowing one's doom was better than facing the endless fog of possibility. In the silence after her words, they felt clarity, even if it was cruel. Delphi's power grew because it answered the deepest of all human desires, to know. Knowledge not just of the world but of destiny, of self. Over centuries, empires would rise and fall, philosophies would evolve, but that hunger for certainty would remain unchanged. The oracle's temple became not just a shrine of Apollo, but a monument to humanity's endless search for meaning. The narrator's tone deepens as the vision widens across the valley of Delphi, terraces of stone, the gleaming columns of the temple, the long line of pilgrims winding upward like an endless thread of hope. Every prophecy spoken here would ripple outward, changing countless lives in ways no one could predict. The narrator whispers, "Kings came here believing they sought truth, but the oracle gave them something more dangerous, the reflection of their own ambitions." For Delphi did not merely reveal the will of the gods. It revealed the hearts of men. The wind rises over the mountains again, carrying the echoes of ancient hymns. The camera pans across the temple's facade as sunlight glints on its marble inscription. Nothing in excess. The phrase gleams like a warning. For power, even divine, is never without cost. And somewhere beneath the smoke and prayers, one begins to wonder. Who guided the oracle herself? Who whispered in the ear of the woman who spoke for the gods? Beneath the temple's polished marble floors, deep within the belly of Mount Parnassus, the air was thick with secrets. For centuries, no one could fully explain what happened to the Pythia when she entered her trance, that sacred moment when she claimed to commune with Apollo himself. To the ancient mind, it was divine possession. The god entering her body, speaking through her voice, lending her the sight that mortals lacked. To modern curiosity, it is one of the greatest enigmas in human history. What truly happened inside the Adyton, the hidden chamber where no light reached, where the oracle breathed in the god? The descriptions left behind are haunting. The Pythia would sit upon her golden tripod, a laurel branch in one hand, a bowl of sacred water in the other. Her body would begin to tremble as the scent of burning bay leaves and myrrh filled the air. Some said her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Others claimed she convulsed, her voice changing, first whispering, then echoing like two voices intertwined, as though Apollo himself spoke beside her. Priests would wait, silent, transcribing every word, their styluses scraping against wax tablets. Sometimes she spoke in riddles, her phrases tangled and strange. Other times, her words poured out in pure poetic rhythm, like verses of prophecy too complex to belong to a mortal tongue. What caused this transformation? The ancients believed it was the god descending, his power made manifest. The Pythia, they said, was chosen by fate, pure of heart, disciplined in ritual, and open enough to be filled with divine essence. She lived apart from others, bound by sacred vows. Once chosen, she gave up her ordinary life. There were no husbands, no children, no personal ambition. She existed only as a vessel. Her humanity was the price of her gift. But there were whispers, darker ones. that her trances were not purely holy, that they were born of forces far more earthly. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began to dig beneath Delphi's ruins, uncovering the truth piece by piece. They found fissures running beneath the temple, cracks in the limestone that emitted faint traces of gas. At first, no one understood what they meant. Then, geologists discovered that these gases contained ethylene, a sweet-smelling compound known to induce euphoria, hallucinations, even trance-like states. It was as though the earth itself was exhaling visions. Could it be that the oracle's divine connection was born of geology rather than the gods? The theory sent shockwaves through both academic and spiritual circles. Imagine it. A natural vapor rising from the mountain's heart, mingling with the incense and the heat of burning laurel, filling the oracle's lungs until she slipped into ecstasy. Her trembling, her wild speech, her otherworldly insight, all the effects of intoxication, perfectly timed by ritual, by belief, and by centuries of faith. It wasn't just gas. It was a theater of transcendence, powered by both nature and conviction. But that explanation alone doesn't satisfy the mystery. For the Pythia's words often contained truths no hallucination could invent. She foresaw storms that sank fleets, plagues that wiped out armies, and shifts in power that no human could have predicted. Even if her mind was chemically altered, something else seemed to be at work. Intuition sharpened by ritual, or perhaps the collective unconscious whispering through her. The Greeks would say it was still Apollo, using the mountain as his conduit. Science might say it was the perfect fusion of environment, psychology, and belief. In Delphi, the line between the natural and supernatural blurred completely. The temple stood atop the meeting point of two geological fault lines, where subterranean forces were strongest. Earthquakes, gases, strange tremors. The mountain was alive. To the ancient priests, this was proof of Apollo's presence, a literal embodiment of his power. To them, the god did not just speak through the Pythia. He spoke from the mountain itself. She was simply his chosen voice, the instrument of his seismic breath. Every element of the ritual seemed designed to intensify this connection. Before entering the Ataton, the Pythia would bathe in the Castalian spring, its icy water shocking her body into alertness. She would then chew on bay leaves, not only a sacred plant of Apollo, but one known to have mild psychoactive properties. The rhythmic chants of priests, the flicker of firelight, the heavy scent of incense, all worked together to heighten her senses, to guide her toward that razor-thin edge between reality and revelation. When the moment came, she would inhale deeply, close her eyes, and vanish into something beyond herself. Witnesses described the sound that followed as both terrifying and beautiful, a voice filled with conviction and mystery, as though the universe spoke through a single fragile human form. Her body swayed, her words spilled forth. The priests listened, transcribed, translated. And in that moment, the mountain, the god, and the woman became one. But even as we try to explain it, something resists dissection. The oracle's gift cannot be reduced to chemistry alone. The gases, the heat, the ritual, all were catalysts. The real power lay in the faith of those who believed. Without their reverence, without centuries of devotion, there would have been no oracle. A hallucination without an audience is madness. A hallucination shared by a civilization becomes divine truth. Delphi was not just a temple, it was a grand collaboration between mind, myth, and mountain. The image of the Pythia, trembling on her tripod, is one of the most haunting in history because it captures that fragile balance between reason and faith. Was she a priestess or a performer, prophet or a pawn? Perhaps she was all of these things, and something more. Her words changed the course of empires. Her voice, fragile yet eternal, became the compass of kings. And yet, when the trance ended, she would awaken exhausted, often shaking, sometimes weeping. Many Pythias served only a few years before their bodies gave out. A few died within the temple itself, consumed by the divine fire they had carried. Still, new women were always chosen. The role was never vacant for long. To the Greeks, the death of an oracle was not a tragedy but a renewal, proof that Apollo's voice could never truly be silenced. Delphi endured because the mystery endured. The mountain continued to breathe, and through that breath, humanity continued to dream. As the smoke curls upward and the sound of chanting fades, the camera lingers on the fissure beneath the temple. A black slit in the earth, exhaling invisible vapors into the dark. Whether those fumes were divine or geological, no one can say. What is certain is that they carried with them the weight of belief strong enough to shape centuries. In that stillness, one begins to understand. The oracle's power was never in what she inhaled, but in what humanity exhaled: faith, fear, and the desperate hunger for meaning. The voice of Apollo may have risen from the rock, but it was belief that made it thunder across the world. The oracle's words rippled far beyond the marble columns of Delphi, traveling across kingdoms like invisible threads binding the fates of men. In a world where wars were declared by whim and empires built on the edge of uncertainty, a single prophecy could become the difference between triumph and ruin. Kings, generals, and philosophers all sought her guidance, not out of blind faith, but because history itself seemed to bend beneath her words. The oracle was not just a priestess. She was the conscience of an age, her breath shaping decisions that would echo through centuries. Every king who came to Delphi arrived already trembling beneath the weight of his own ambitions. They asked questions of the gods, but what they truly sought were confirmations of their desires. Shall I go to war? Shall I rule this land? Will the gods favor my bloodline? Each question was a mirror, and the oracle's answer reflected not truth, but the dangerous alignment between belief and destiny. The most famous of these tales belong to the great figures of ancient history, men whose stories we still tell, because the oracle's words still haunt them. Consider Croesus, the golden king of Lydia, whose wealth was legendary even among the Greeks. In his palace of shimmering gold, he heard whispers of the oracle's power and sent envoys to Delphi bearing unimaginable treasures: ingots, jewels, goblets of silver. He asked a question that would define his legacy. If I go to war against Persia, will I destroy a great empire? The Pythia's response came as pure poetry, a prophecy layered in ambiguity. If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus rejoiced. He believed it meant victory, that Apollo himself had blessed his conquest. With confidence born of divine assurance, he marched his armies across the Halys River and attacked Cyrus the Great. The result was catastrophe. His own empire fell. The prophecy had been true, but not in the way he expected. The empire destroyed was his own, and as the flames of Sardis rose into the sky, Croesus realized too late the cruel genius of Delphi's riddles. The gods always spoke the truth, but never promised to make it easy to understand. The story became a warning, whispered by future rulers. The oracle gave answers but never certainty. Her gift was not knowledge, but reflection. The wisest among them, like the philosopher Socrates, understood this. When asked who was the wisest man in Greece, the oracle had replied, "None is wiser than Socrates." Astonished, Socrates declared that he knew nothing, and thus the god must mean that wisdom lies in admitting one's ignorance. That interpretation became the cornerstone of Western philosophy. The oracle had not crowned a king. She had crowned humility as divine. For generals, however, the oracle's words carried different weight. When the Athenians faced the oncoming Persian invasion, they turned to Delphi in desperation. The priests led the Pythia into the temple, and she emerged trembling, declaring that the city would fall, that only the wooden walls would save them. Panic spread. What did it mean? Some thought it meant fortifications, but the strategist Themistocles interpreted it differently. The wooden walls were their ships. He convinced the Athenians to abandon their city and fight at sea. The result was the Battle of Salamis, one of the most decisive victories in ancient history. Themistocles had not only understood the oracle's riddle, he had used it to save Greece itself. These stories reveal something profound about Delphi's influence. The oracle did not dictate history. She shaped how people perceived it. Her words were like seeds planted in the minds of leaders, growing into choices that would determine the fate of nations. Whether those choices led to ruin or glory depended on how deeply they listened. In this way, the oracle was both prophet and mirror, a reflection of the human condition itself, where faith and interpretation entwine to create destiny. But there was another side to Delphi's influence, one more political and calculated. Behind the oracle's divine veil stood a network of priests and attendants, educated men who controlled access to her, who interpreted her words, who communicated her prophecies to the world. These were not simple servants of Apollo. They were diplomats, mediators, and sometimes manipulators. They knew which kingdoms offered tribute, which sought favor, which feared rebellion. It was easy, perhaps too easy, to let prophecy tilt ever so slightly toward those who would protect Delphi's sacred interests. This subtle manipulation made the oracle a geopolitical weapon. City-states used her words to justify war, colonization, and law. Sparta claimed divine right to its militarism. Corinth invoked Apollo's will to defend its trade empire. Even foreign rulers sought Delphi's approval, for a Greek god's favor carried weight across the ancient world. The oracle became the invisible hand guiding diplomacy, a divine endorsement that could legitimize any act, however ruthless, as destiny. Yet not all were blind to the politics behind prophecy. Some questioned how a god could so conveniently serve mortal ambition. The philosopher Xenophanes mocked the idea of divine partiality, suggesting that if horses had gods, they would imagine them in their own image. Others noticed how the oracle's messages always seemed to preserve Delphi's sanctity, ensuring that no matter the outcome of war or peace, the temple's treasures grew. Still, faith endured. To doubt the oracle was to doubt Apollo, and few dared such blasphemy. The people needed to believe that somewhere in the chaos of their world, there was a voice that knew, a voice untouched by greed or fear. Delphi provided that illusion, and perhaps it was not an illusion at all. For even if her words were shaped by human hands, the wisdom they carried transcended any mortal scheme. In guiding kings, she revealed not only the will of gods but the limits of human understanding. As centuries passed, the stories accumulated. Some were triumphs, others tragedies. But each one added to Delphi's mythos, a growing archive of divine dialogue between the heavens and humanity. The oracle became not just a voice of Apollo, but the voice of time itself. Her prophecies carried the weight of inevitability, as if fate itself had chosen Delphi as its mouthpiece. Imagine the scene. A king kneeling in the temple's shadow, the mountain wind whistling through the columns, the scent of burning laurel heavy in the air. His heart races as the Pythia's voice trembles through the darkness. Her words strike him not like commands, but like riddles echoing through eternity. He leaves the temple uncertain, yet convinced that he has heard the truth. And in that conviction, his fate is sealed. For that is the power of belief. It does not require clarity, only conviction. The oracle's genius was not in answering questions, but in shaping how questions were asked. Each prophecy reflected the asker's soul. In trying to understand the gods, men revealed themselves. And as night falls over the mountain, the fires of Delphi burn like stars upon the earth. The priests close the temple gates, their robes whispering against the marble. Somewhere within, the Pythia rests, her voice quiet now, but her words still moving through the world like invisible fire, lighting the path of destiny one soul at a time. For centuries, the oracle's voice guided the ancient world like a divine compass. Yet beneath her words, deeper currents stirred. Power has always attracted power, and even the gods' messengers were not immune to the ambitions of men. The sanctuary at Delphi was not merely a spiritual haven. It was a treasury, a bank, and a political machine disguised as a temple. Gold gleamed in its vaults, tribute flowed from every corner of the Greek world, and priests walked the marble courtyards knowing they held something rarer than wealth, control over belief itself. To manipulate prophecy was to shape reality. And in time, those who served Apollo learned to use the god's silence as skillfully as his voice. The priests of Delphi were an elite class, bound by ritual and secrecy. To the outside world, they were mere interpreters, transcribing the Pythia's ecstatic mutterings into coherent prophecies. But within the temple's sacred order, they were far more than scribes. They were the guardians of Apollo's will, and that meant deciding what the god's words truly meant or should mean. Each prophecy that left Delphi bore their unseen fingerprints. A slight change in tone, a missing phrase, an interpretive flourish, all could tip the balance of nations. They were scholars of language, philosophers, and statesmen rolled into one. Some were idealists who believed that by guiding kings, they served both God and mankind. Others were pragmatists who saw prophecy as a tool, a way to preserve Delphi's power in a volatile world. The temple, after all, existed at the mercy of politics. Armies could march on it. Rulers could turn away from it. To keep Apollo's light burning, the priests had to navigate the darkness of human ambition, and so they became diplomats in robes. When rival city-states came seeking prophecy, the priests weighed every word carefully. If they favored one side too strongly, the other might retaliate. If they angered both, Delphi's sanctity could be destroyed. They walked a knife's edge, crafting messages that balanced faith and neutrality, or, at times, manipulated both to Delphi's advantage. Some called it divine wisdom. Others called it political genius. The sanctuary's wealth only deepened this tension. Every consultation required offerings, silver tripods, statues, treasure. Foreign envoys came laden with gifts, knowing that generosity could open divine ears. Over centuries, these offerings filled Delphi's treasuries to bursting. The sacred way that led to the temple became a glittering parade of monuments built by grateful or fearful patrons. Athens erected gleaming statues, Corinth built marble halls, and the Spartans dedicated golden shields taken from conquered foes. The result was breathtaking. A mountain transformed into a museum of victory and devotion. But beneath that beauty lay a truth few dared to voice. The oracle had become the keeper of a vast economy of faith. Each prophecy then had a price. Not a price measured in coin alone, but in allegiance. When the oracle's words favored one ruler, it strengthened Delphi's bond with him. When she warned another to act cautiously, it reminded him that even kings were subject to divine scrutiny. Through this subtle dance of influence, Delphi maintained its untouchable status for centuries. No army dared attack what the gods themselves protected. No empire could rise without first kneeling at the mountain's feet. And yet, the power that Delphi wielded was fragile, because it relied on the illusion of divine purity. The priests knew that if anyone ever saw through the veil, if anyone dared to accuse them of manipulation, the entire edifice could crumble. So they guarded their methods with fanatic devotion. The Pythia's chamber was restricted to a chosen few. Her trance was sacred, her words inviolable. Even the scribes who transcribed her utterances were sworn to secrecy. Those who broke their vows were said to vanish, swallowed by Apollo's mountain, punished for betraying divine trust. Whether these stories were true or simply temple-crafted myths, they kept fear alive, and fear maintained silence. But whispers persisted. Some pilgrims left Delphi uneasy, claiming that the oracle's answers sounded rehearsed, that the priests had steered their questions toward convenient outcomes. A few even suggested that certain cities received miraculously favorable prophecies after sending lavish gifts. Still, none dared challenge the temple openly. To accuse Delphi of deceit was to risk divine wrath, and, perhaps more dangerously, political ruin. One story from the 5th century BCE tells of a minor city-state that defied Apollo's priests. Its envoys accused them of manipulating prophecies to favor their rivals. Within a year, the city was struck by famine and disease. Its people fled, its temples burned, and its name vanished from the maps of Greece. The message was clear: the gods defended their own. Whether the destruction came from natural disaster or Delphi's hand mattered little. Faith filled in the blanks. Over time, the priests' mastery of perception became as powerful as the oracle's visions. They understood that people did not come to Delphi seeking truth. They came seeking meaning. And meaning could be shaped, refined, and sold like gold. Their genius lay not in deception, but in narrative. Each prophecy was crafted to resonate with the listener's fears and desires. If a ruler sought conquest, the oracle offered a riddle that could be read as divine approval, or as a warning cloaked in hope. In this way, every outcome confirmed Apollo's wisdom. If victory followed, it was proof of his favor. If disaster struck, It was punishment for misunderstanding him. The god could never be wrong. Still, for all their control, the priests lived in quiet fear of one thing: silence. For if the Pythia ever ceased to speak, if the mountain's breath ever stopped, their entire world would collapse. Without prophecy, there was no Delphi. Without Delphi, there was no Apollo. Every tremor beneath the earth, every strange stillness in the air, carried the weight of dread. What if the god was growing tired of them? What if the divine voice they had tended for centuries was about to fade into nothingness? And so, they guarded the flame with obsessive devotion. They trained new Pythias, maintained the rituals, purified the springs, offered sacrifices at dawn and dusk. The temple's rhythm was relentless, eternal. To the world, it was devotion. To the priests, it was survival. But power built on mystery always casts a shadow. The more the priests sought to protect the oracle's sanctity, the more they bound themselves to deception. Each prophecy that preserved Delphi's dominance also chipped away at its purity. And in time, the question that haunted them was no longer what will the oracle say, but who truly speaks when she does. As dusk falls over Mount Parnassus, the golden statues glint in the fading light. The sacred way is empty now, the pilgrims gone, the air still thick with incense. Inside the temple, a lone priest kneels beside the Pythia's seat, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. He listens for the faintest whisper rising from the fissure beneath him, not from the god, but from the mountain itself. The sound is low, like breathing. It reminds him that Delphi's power does not belong to gods or men alone, but to something far older, buried in the heart of the earth, patient and waiting. The oracle's reputation stretched across the seas, and soon, even those who were not Greek came seeking her counsel. As the ancient world expanded and the Mediterranean became a network of competing powers, Delphi transformed from a local sanctuary into a crossroads of civilization. Foreign envoys, traders, and kings all came to kneel before Apollo's priestess, bringing with them questions written in the languages of many lands, and tributes that filled the temple's coffers with treasures from across the known world. To stand before the oracle was no longer merely a religious act. It was an initiation into the very machinery of empire. By the 6th century BCE, Delphi was not only the heart of Greek spirituality, but also one of its greatest diplomatic arenas. The oracle's voice had become a kind of international law, one that transcended borders. When colonies were founded in distant lands, from Italy to the Black Sea, their leaders often came to Delphi first. "Where shall we build our new city?" they would ask, and the Pythia's answer would become their compass. Her words sent Greeks sailing to unknown shores, carrying with them the flame of Apollo, the language of prophecy, and the belief that their destinies had been divinely chosen. The priests understood this power well. They recorded the names of every city that sought guidance, cataloging their dedications in marble inscriptions. These lists were not just records of devotion, they were instruments of influence. Through them, Delphi tracked alliances, rivalries, and debts of faith that stretched across continents. Every new city that rose under the oracle's direction became, in a sense, a child of Apollo, bound to the sanctuary by invisible ties of gratitude and reverence. One of the most remarkable examples was the founding of Cyrene, a Greek colony in North Africa. When its leader, Battus, came to Delphi seeking guidance, the oracle told him to sail toward the land where the heavenly rain falls from the sky. Confused but obedient, Battus embarked on his journey, following a trail of clues that eventually led him to the fertile coast of modern Libya. There, he built Cyrene, a city that would flourish for centuries, famed for its wealth and wisdom. And through it all, Delphi remained its spiritual heart, the unseen hand that had pointed the way. But Delphi's influence was not confined to new settlements. It shaped wars and peace across the ancient world. When the Persians loomed over Greece, their armies vast and unstoppable, cities turned once again to the oracle. Her responses were often ambiguous, poetic riddles wrapped in warning. Yet those riddles carried weight enough to shift the course of strategy and courage. Themistocles' interpretation of the wooden walls had saved Athens, but elsewhere, prophecies inspired betrayal, cowardice, or reckless heroism. In every outcome, Delphi remained blameless. The gods' words could always be read anew. Foreign powers, too, sought the oracle's favor. The Lydians, the Egyptians, even emissaries of faraway Babylon are said to have offered tribute. For them, the oracle represented something rare, a neutral voice in a world of rival gods. Delphi, perched high above the Greek world, seemed untouched by mortal conflict. It was a temple that belonged to everyone and no one, and that illusion of neutrality made it irresistible to kings who sought divine legitimacy. When the Persian general Mardonius planned his campaign against Greece, his advisors warned him of Delphi's power. The oracle, they said, had never lied. Some claimed that Apollo himself had promised to protect his sanctuary, that any army that dared attack it would be destroyed. According to legend, when the Persians eventually approached Delphi, thunder erupted from the sky, boulders fell from Mount Parnassus, and the invaders fled in terror. Whether this was divine intervention or clever stagecraft by the priests, history recorded it as proof that Delphi's god defended his own. The mountain itself had spoken, and Apollo's dominion was reaffirmed. Through such stories, Delphi's legend grew. Even distant lands began to see it as a place where the boundary between heaven and earth thinned to a whisper. Travelers spoke of the sacred laurel groves, the silver fountains, and the eternal fire burning in Apollo's name. They told of the Pythia's voice, how it trembled like wind through the trees, how it revealed truths in half-light and silence. Some came as believers, others as skeptics, but all left changed. For even the doubters could not escape the awe of that mountain, its air heavy with incense and eternity. The oracle's fame reached its height during the golden age of Greece, when philosophers, poets, and statesmen alike sought her words. Plato described Delphi as the navel of the world, the place where the earth's deepest wisdom emerged. Her influence penetrated literature, law, and art. Apollo's temple was not merely a house of prophecy. It was a school of the soul. People learned from it not just what to do, but how to see. Still, there were shadows among the light. As Delphi's influence grew, so too did the envy and suspicion surrounding it. Rival sanctuaries, like Dodona, where Zeus was said to speak through rustling oak leaves, challenged Apollo's supremacy. Political leaders began to realize that control of the oracle's words meant control of the people's faith. A single favorable prophecy could secure loyalty, justify war, or sanctify tyranny. Thus, Delphi became a battlefield of subtler wars, not of swords, but of whispers, gold, and persuasion. The Amphictyonic League, the ancient council of states charged with protecting Delphi, became increasingly politicized. Once a brotherhood of piety, it turned into a stage for power struggles. Athens and Sparta both sought to dominate the council, each claiming to be the true guardian of Apollo. The temple's priests played a dangerous game of balance, attempting to maintain neutrality while ensuring Delphi's survival. Every decision was weighed, every word calculated. For if Delphi lost its divine credibility, it would lose everything. Yet, amid all these intrigues, something purer endured. The pilgrims, the common people, still came year after year. They came not for politics but for hope. Farmers prayed for rain. Mothers asked for healing. Sailors begged for safe passage. To them, Delphi was not a throne of power but a doorway to meaning. The oracle's words were not riddles. They were lifelines. And that simple faith, humble and enduring, was what truly kept Apollo's temple alive. As night descends upon the sanctuary, the torches flicker along the sacred way, casting long shadows across the marble statues of gods and kings. The wind moves softly through the pines, carrying with it the faint murmur of countless prayers whispered across time. In the stillness, it is easy to imagine the world as it once was, vast, uncertain, filled with questions. And in the heart of it all, a single voice rose from the mountain, speaking for gods and men alike, reminding both that destiny was not a chain, but a conversation. But as Delphi's fame spread across the world, so too did its secrets begin to darken. For all its sacred light, the oracle's world was one of quiet manipulation, a theater of divine illusion sustained by human hands. Beneath the marble and incense, there existed a system, an intricate choreography of ritual, psychology, and perhaps something more mysterious still. The oracle spoke with the voice of Apollo, yes, but what gave her that voice? What truly happened in the depths of the temple when the god was said to descend? The ancient writers give us fragments, glimpses behind the veil. The Pythia, they tell us, sat upon a tripod above a fissure in the earth. From that crack rose vapors, the pneuma, said to carry the god's spirit. When she inhaled it, her body trembled, her eyes rolled back, and her voice transformed into something otherworldly. Priests would surround her, interpreting her wild utterances into coherent verses, the prophecies the world would hear. But even in antiquity, whispers arose. Was it truly the god who spoke, or were the priests shaping the message for their own ends? For centuries, the mystery deepened. Philosophers and skeptics tried to explain the oracle's trances. Some claimed it was the fumes, intoxicating gases rising from the chasm. Others argued that it was simply the power of belief, the intensity of ritual ecstasy. Yet others hinted at darker forces, the use of hallucinogenic herbs, perhaps, or even deliberate deception. But no matter how the theories multiplied, the experience itself, the trembling priestess, the god's voice echoing through her, remained a truth too profound for easy dismissal. Then, for a time, the fissure was forgotten. The ground beneath the temple was sealed, buried by centuries of earthquakes and ruin. Modern scholars, studying Delphi in the 19th and early 20th centuries, dismissed the ancient stories of vapors and trances as myth. They found no fissure, no smell of gas, no sign of the miraculous pneuma. To them, the oracle was purely psychological, a product of suggestion and ritual. The idea of divine intoxication was a poetic fantasy, nothing more. But time, as it often does, had its own revelation to offer. In the 1980s, a team of geologists led by Gel de Boer and archaeologist John Hale began to study the bedrock beneath Delphi anew. What they discovered changed everything. The Temple of Apollo, it turned out, was built precisely above the intersection of two geological fault lines. These faults ran through layers of limestone rich in bituminous deposits, substances that, when fractured by tectonic pressure, released ethylene gas, a mildly narcotic vapor capable of inducing trance-like states. Suddenly, the old stories made sense again. The pneuma was real, not a metaphor, but a natural phenomenon that had once risen from the earth itself. The Pythia, breathing in those invisible vapors, would have entered a genuine altered state of consciousness. Her mind, half lucid and half beyond, would drift between worlds. What she saw and said in that state, filtered through the expectations of faith and the guidance of priests, became the oracles that shaped empires. Science had not killed the mystery. It had deepened it. Ethylene gas, the researchers noted, can produce sensations of floating, euphoria, and detachment from the body. In higher concentrations, it may cause hallucinations or the sense of hearing voices. To those gathered in the darkened Aton, the inner chamber where the oracle sat, it would have seemed as if the god himself had truly arrived. The Pythia's voice, trembling and echoing in the stone, would take on the weight of the divine. Every breath, every flicker of torchlight, became part of an ancient alchemy, one where nature, faith, and fear intertwined. But this discovery also raised troubling questions. If the oracle's power depended on geology, what did that mean for divinity? Was Apollo's voice merely the whisper of the earth itself, an ancient natural force mistaken for godhood? Or, more unsettling still, was this the very way in which gods do speak? Through the hidden rhythms of the natural world, through gases, winds, and tremors that humans could never fully comprehend? The ancients, perhaps, had known something we have forgotten, that the divine and the material are not opposites, but mirrors of one another. The priests of Delphi, whether knowingly or not, built their temple at the perfect spot, a convergence of physical and spiritual energy. Every ritual, from the burning of laurel leaves to the pouring of holy water into the Cassoda spring, may have been designed to enhance the natural forces already present beneath the mountain. The oracle's chamber, small and enclosed, would have trapped the fumes, intensifying their effect. And over centuries, this interplay between nature and faith became a ritual so refined so sacred, that it blurred the line between manipulation and miracle. Yet not every oracle spoke with equal clarity. Ancient accounts tell of times when the Pythia's voice was weak, her words confused. Once, the philosopher Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, recorded that a prophecy given during such a time led to tragedy. The Pythia, forced to perform when the god was absent, fell into convulsions and died soon after. The priests, terrified, declared that Apollo had withdrawn. For months, the sanctuary fell silent. It was as if the mountain itself had stopped breathing. This silence hints at something deeper, a secret rhythm known only to the priests. They may have understood that the pneuma was not constant, that the earth's breath came and went with the movements of tectonic pressure and rainfall. The god's voice was not always present. It had to be coaxed, waited for, honored. Perhaps this was the true mystery of Delphi. Not that the god spoke constantly, but that the priests had learned when to listen. In this light, the oracle's power becomes both more human and more divine. It was human in its dependence on the earth, on chemistry and timing. Yet it was divine in what it represented, the endless human longing to hear meaning in the world's murmurs. The people who came to Delphi were not fools. They knew, deep down, that prophecy was uncertain, that the future was mist. But in that sacred mist, they found something greater than prediction. They found wonder. And so, Delphi stood at the crossroads of science and spirit long before such distinctions existed. Its priests, without instruments or laboratories, had discovered the hidden pulse of the planet. Its oracle, through trance and breath, became the bridge between the human and the elemental. To the Greeks, that bridge was Apollo, radiant, distant, yet intimately present in the trembling voice of a mortal woman. Even today, as the modern traveler stands among the ruins, breathing the dry mountain air, it is hard not to imagine what once filled that space. The sweet, strange scent of gases, the low chanting of priests, the flicker of firelight on bronze. The oracle's voice is gone, but the stone still hums with memory. The fissures still lie beneath, waiting, as if one day the mountain might breathe again, and a voice might rise once more to ask the question that haunts every age. What is destiny, and who dares to speak it? The Oracle of Delphi had spoken for centuries, her voice shaping the fates of kings, guiding armies, and consecrating empires. But by the 5th century BCE, that voice began to falter. The world around Delphi was changing. The Greek city-states, once united in faith and rivalry, were descending into a new age of turmoil, an age of philosophers, skeptics, and politics that no longer bowed so easily before the unseen gods. And yet, amid the rise of reason and democracy, the oracle still stood at the heart of it all, a whisper that neither war nor doubt could silence. At first, it seemed as though Delphi would flourish forever. The temple was rebuilt after fires, its marble steps shining once again in the sun. The pilgrims kept coming, generals before campaigns, poets before their great works, even ordinary people seeking the smallest blessings. But now there was a tension in the air. The faith that had once been unquestioned was beginning to fracture. The philosophers of Athens were asking dangerous questions. Men like Xenophanes and Heraclitus began to challenge the old stories, suggesting that the gods were not beings at all, but forces, symbols of nature, mind, or order. And yet, despite their doubts, even they could not ignore the oracle's influence. Her voice still reached across Greece like a tide. During the Peloponnesian War, both Athens and Sparta sought her guidance, each convinced that Apollo favored them. Her answers, as always, were cryptic, capable of being read in both directions. "The victory shall belong to the one who honors Apollo," she declared. The priests, careful and cunning, ensured that her words could never betray the sanctuary's neutrality. Delphi survived, as it always had, by speaking in riddles. But this balancing act came at a cost. The political wars of men began to infect the sacred. The oracle was now entangled in a web of propaganda and suspicion. When the Spartans gained the upper hand in the war, they claimed that the god had chosen them. When Athens rebuilt its empire, it said the same. The priests found themselves accused of bribery, of forging prophecies, of selling Apollo's words to the highest bidder. Even the most devout began to wonder, could the divine truth be purchased with gold? The Amphictyonic League, the council that guarded Delphi, was torn apart by corruption and conflict. In 356 BCE, these tensions exploded into what history would remember as the Sacred War, a brutal struggle over the control of the temple itself. The Phocians, accused of sacrilege, seized Delphi and its treasures, melting down sacred offerings to fund their army. To them, the oracle was not a symbol of faith, but a source of immense wealth, and the right to control her meant the right to shape Greece's destiny. For a decade, blood was spilled in Apollo's name. Armies marched not for freedom or revenge, but for the god's gold. The oracle, once the voice of divine harmony, became a prisoner of mortal greed. Yet through all this, her priestesses continued to sit upon the tripod, to inhale the sacred fumes, and to speak as they always had. Perhaps they believed that Apollo still spoke, even amid chaos. Or perhaps they had learned the truth, that the god's silence was the greatest test of faith. When the war finally ended, Delphi was left scarred but unbroken. The temple was restored, its treasures replenished, and the oracle's voice returned. But the world that awaited her was no longer the same. Macedon had risen, and with it came a new kind of power, one that saw prophecy not as divine truth but as a tool. Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, visited the oracle and was told that he would become irresistible. Whether those words came from Apollo or from politics no longer mattered. They became self-fulfilling. For when a king believes himself chosen, the world will bend to his belief. When Alexander himself stood before the Pythia, the story takes a turn both shocking and symbolic. It is said that when he arrived, demanding a prophecy of conquest, the oracle refused to speak. It was not the appointed day. Enraged, Alexander seized her arm and dragged her toward the tripod. In that moment, terrified, she cried out, "You are invincible, my son." Alexander released her, smiling. "That," he said, "is all I needed to hear." He turned and left, convinced that Apollo had spoken through her unwilling lips. It was a moment that defined the shifting age. The gods no longer commanded kings, kings commanded the gods. The oracle's authority, once absolute, was now a mirror to mortal ambition. Men came not to seek their fate, but to demand that fate bend before them. The voice of Delphi, which had once whispered in the ears of heroes, was now echoing in the corridors of empires. As Alexander's conquests carried Greek culture across the world, the sanctuaries of old began to lose their gravity. The new cities of Asia and Egypt had their own temples, their own oracles. The old gods, while still revered, became more abstract, symbols of a shared past rather than living powers. Delphi endured, but its light dimmed, like a lamp left burning in an empty room. Still, there were moments when the old magic flickered to life. Travelers from distant lands continued to visit, drawn by stories of the mountain that spoke. The priests, wise and weary, kept the rituals alive, the purification in the Castalian spring, the burning of laurel leaves, the offering of goat sacrifices before each consultation. They knew that belief was a fragile thing, easily lost but never entirely extinguished. As long as one pilgrim still climbed the sacred path, Apollo's fire would not go out. And perhaps, beneath the politics and the decay, there was something eternal that no corruption could touch. The oracle's words, ambiguous as they were, reflected a truth deeper than prediction, that every destiny is shaped by choice. Her riddles forced men to confront themselves, their fears, their pride, their faith. That was the real prophecy. The god did not dictate fate. He revealed the measure of the soul that sought it. So as the Hellenistic world dawned, a world of conquerors, scholars, and skeptics, Delphi stood as a relic of both faith and philosophy. To some, it was a superstition from a vanished age. To others, it was the last living bridge between man and mystery. And though its voice was fading, it had already accomplished what no empire ever could. It had taught humanity that the search for meaning, the hunger to hear the divine, is older, and perhaps holier, than any god we name. As night fell upon the temple's white stones, The priests extinguished the torches and sealed the sacred chamber. The mountain exhaled its silence once more. But somewhere, in the darkness, a question still lingered, the same one that had haunted kings and poets for centuries. When the gods fall silent, does the world grow empty, or does it finally learn to listen for itself? The centuries that followed Alexander's death brought both grandeur and decay to Delphi. The Hellenistic age was one of contradictions, a time when the Greek world expanded across continents, but its spiritual heart began to hollow. The oracle still spoke, but her words were no longer the thunder of destiny. They had become echoes, faint, uncertain, almost weary. The kings who came to Delphi now did so less from faith than from formality, as if paying homage to a god they no longer feared but could not yet forget. The temples gleamed, but the world they looked upon had changed. The philosophers of Athens had planted seeds that would outlive empires: reason, logic, skepticism. These ideas spread through the courts of kings and the minds of scholars. The great thinkers of the New Age, Epicurus, Zeno, the Stoics, began to see fate not as the decree of gods, but as a law written into the cosmos itself. They spoke of reason, of natural order, of man's ability to understand the divine without needing its oracles. Delphi, once the living center of the world, now stood like an ancient star, still burning but outshone by the dawn of human thought. And yet, even as reason rose, superstition refused to die. The people still believed not in philosophy, but in signs, omens, and mysteries. For every skeptic who dismissed the oracle, 100 pilgrims still climbed the sacred way. The human need for hope remained stronger than the human thirst for logic. Farmers still offered grain. Soldiers still asked for victory. Mothers still prayed for their children's lives. The priests, wise in the ways of survival, continued to offer what the people needed: answers that comforted, riddles that endured. Delphi became a crossroads of two worlds, the mystical and the rational. The Stoics, who believed that divine reason permeated everything, saw the oracle not as superstition but as harmony made visible. The Pythia's trance, they argued, was proof that human beings could become instruments of the cosmos, voices through which divine reason flowed. Others, like the cynics, mocked her as a relic of ignorance, a performer lost in fumes and tradition. The debates echoed through the marble courtyards, through the temples and schools that surrounded Apollo's shrine. The mountain itself seemed to listen, patient, indifferent, eternal. But then came a new force from the west, one that would change everything. Rome, the Republic, and later the Empire, looked upon Delphi not as a holy place but as a monument of cultural prestige. The Romans, practical and powerful, did not seek prophecies. They sought legitimacy. To them, Delphi was a crown of the Greek world, a symbol of civilization, art, and divine heritage that could be absorbed into their own vast order. When Roman generals visited the oracle, they did so as conquerors, not supplicants. Still, the oracle adapted. She had always adapted. When Rome rose, Delphi simply changed her language. She spoke in flatteries and allegories, telling emperors what they most wished to hear, that their rule was destined, their victories sanctioned by Apollo himself. Augustus, ever the master of image, declared himself favored by the gods and restored many of Greece's ancient sanctuaries, including Delphi. For a time, the temple's fires burned bright again. The marble was repaired, the statues polished, the rituals renewed. But the spark was different now. The oracle no longer guided nations. She served them. Her words had become a tool of empire, her divinity reduced to ceremony. The Roman Senate even declared Apollo one of their patron gods, not out of faith, but out of politics. Temples to Apollo rose in Rome itself, their architecture echoing the design of Delphi, as if to claim that the center of the world had shifted westward. Yet even in this age of empire, whispers persisted of moments when the old power returned. Some Roman senators, after consulting the oracle, swore that they had felt her presence, that strange stillness before she spoke, the electric hush as if the mountain itself was breathing. A few claimed that her eyes glowed with something beyond mortal understanding. Others, more skeptical, hinted that the priests still knew how to use the earth's secrets, the vapors, the herbs, the hidden mechanisms of ecstasy, to recreate the illusion of Apollo's descent. Plutarch, the philosopher priest who served at Delphi in the 1st century CE, offered a different view altogether. He saw the oracle not as a fraud or a relic, but as a voice struggling to endure. He wrote that the god spirit did not dwell in any single place but moved like a breath through the world, finding expression wherever humans sought truth with sincerity. To him, the fading of the oracle was not a sign of failure but of transformation, a shift in how humanity connected with the divine. But beneath such noble interpretations lay an uncomfortable truth. Delphi was in decline. The temple's revenues dwindled. The festivals drew fewer crowds. The priests grew old, their ranks unfilled. Earthquakes damaged the sacred structures. Landslides buried parts of the ancient terraces. Nature itself seemed to be reclaiming what had once been its own. The fumes that had once risen from the earth grew weaker, their mysterious power fading. The Pythia's trances became rarer, her voice less certain. To the Romans, this was merely the passing of an age. To the Greeks, it was the god himself withdrawing from the world. And yet, even as the sanctuary decayed, its myths deepened. The fewer prophecies she gave, the more precious each became. Those who did seek her out came not for war or empire but for wisdom, private questions of the soul. How should I live? What is the nature of the good? The oracle, once the voice of politics, had become the voice of philosophy. Her riddles turned inward. It was as if Delphi, in her final centuries, ceased to speak to nations and began to speak to humanity itself. By the 2nd century CE, the temple was a shadow of its former glory. The Romans still honored it, but mostly out of respect for tradition. Pilgrims came less frequently, their coins fewer, their faith quieter. The oracle's words were still recorded, but they no longer carried the same weight. The Pythia had become a symbol, the last breath of an age when gods walked beside men. And yet, the silence was not absolute. On certain days, when the wind passed through the ruins and the sunlight struck the marble just right, the people of Delphi would say they could still hear her, a whisper like the rustle of laurel leaves, faint and haunting. Some said it was the god, mourning his fading temple. Others said it was the mountain itself, exhaling the last memory of 1,000 years of faith. Delphi was dying, but she was dying beautifully, like a sunset that refuses to darken, lingering in colors no artist can name. And perhaps that was fitting. For what is prophecy, if not the art of light fading into shadow, of knowing that even endings are only another kind of truth? The world that once knelt before Delphi was vanishing. The Roman Empire, vast and glittering, had become a place of marble and doubt, where gods were worshipped, yes, but with the weary politeness of habit rather than the trembling faith of old. Yet in this twilight of ancient belief, a new light was beginning to burn. One that would soon outshine the temples, silence the oracles, and forever change the way humanity spoke of the divine. Its name was Christianity, and with it came both revelation and ruin. The first followers of this new faith were seen as madmen, a strange sect from the East, whispering of one God, one truth, one salvation. To the priests of Apollo, this idea was unthinkable, almost laughable. How could the cosmos be ruled by a single, jealous deity? The Greeks had lived in a universe of harmony and multiplicity, where every force of nature had its god, and the oracle's words wove them together into meaning. But the Christians brought with them something different. Not harmony, but certainty. Not questions, but answers. And that certainty would prove fatal to Delphi. At first, the two worlds coexisted in uneasy silence. Rome was tolerant of gods so long as they did not challenge the emperor's authority. Many early Christians were ignored, even pitied. Yet their faith grew, quietly, inexorably, spreading through soldiers, slaves, and scholars alike. And as it grew, it began to confront the old ways. Temples that had stood for 1,000 years suddenly found themselves the targets of contempt. Pagan rituals were dismissed as superstition, the oracles as demons. The gods of Greece and Rome were no longer divine. They were cast as falsehoods, temptations, even devils in disguise. For Delphi, this was the beginning of the end. By the 3rd century CE, the Temple of Apollo had already fallen into disrepair. Earthquakes had cracked its foundation. Landslides had scarred its terraces. The priests, struggling to maintain the rituals, were now fewer, older, and poorer. Yet they continued, stubborn and devout, performing the ancient ceremonies even as the crowds thinned. They burned laurel leaves. They purified the Pythia in the Castalian spring. They waited for the god's breath to rise from the fissure. But the pneuma no longer came. The mountain was silent. Still, the legend of Delphi's power lingered, and that lingering power made it dangerous. The emperors of Rome, now caught between tradition and the growing tide of Christianity, found themselves forced to choose. Some sought to protect the old sanctuaries, others to destroy them. Emperor Julian, called the apostate by later historians, tried one last time to rekindle the ancient flame. A philosopher and mystic, Julian saw the gods not as superstition but as symbols of divine wisdom. He restored Delphi's funding, ordered sacrifices once more, and prayed for Apollo's return. But when his envoys arrived at the temple, the priests met them with despair. It is said that the last oracle spoke then, a final prophecy, whispered through the trembling voice of an aging Pythia. "Tell the king, the fair-built hall has fallen. Apollo no longer has his house, nor his prophetic spring, nor laurel-bearing voice. The water that once spoke has gone silent." Those words, recorded by the historian Zosimus, marked the death of Delphi. The god who had once spoken to kings and conquerors was gone. The sacred spring had dried, the fissure sealed, the temple abandoned. Whether this was truly the last prophecy or a poetic invention, none could say. But to the people of Greece, it was as though the mountain itself had declared the end of an age. In the decades that followed, the Christianization of the empire became official. Emperor Theodosius, in 394 CE, issued decrees banning pagan worship. The temples of the old gods were closed, their treasures confiscated, their statues broken or reinterpreted as symbols of sin. The fires on Apollo's altar were extinguished, not by time or neglect, but by decree. The priests were dispersed, their names erased. The sacred path became overgrown with weeds. Delphi, once the navel of the world, became a ghost. But legends never die so easily. Even as Christianity spread, the people of Greece could not entirely let go of their ancient mountain. They told stories of lights that flickered above the ruins on certain nights, of strange music carried on the wind, of a voice, faint, echoing, that still rose from the stones when the moon was full. To the faithful, these were the whispers of demons. To the few who still remembered the old faith, they were Apollo's laments. There is a haunting symmetry in Delphi's fall. For centuries, the oracle had given answers to those who sought certainty. Now, a new faith had come, one that promised an absolute truth. The roles had reversed. What was once mystery had become heresy, and what was once heresy had become truth. Humanity had traded its questions for commandments. And perhaps, in that trade, something precious was lost, the humility to wonder. The ruins did not remain empty forever. Christian hermits and monks settled there, building small chapels amid the fallen columns. They prayed to their new god in the shadow of the old one, perhaps sensing that holiness clings to certain places no matter what names we give it. The Castalian spring still flowed, and the monks used its water for baptism. In time, Delphi became a Christian village, its pagan past buried beneath layers of faith and forgetting. And yet, the silence of Apollo's temple remained different from the silence of other ruins. Travelers who passed through in later centuries described a strange feeling, as if the air itself remembered. The earth beneath still held the warmth of old fires, the faint scent of incense. It was as though the god had not left, but merely withdrawn, sleeping beneath the stones, waiting for the world to remember how to listen. Some scholars have suggested that Delphi's death was not destruction, but transformation, that its spirit lived on, reshaped within the very faith that replaced it. Christianity, after all, would come to speak in prophecy too. Saints and mystics claimed visions, the Virgin was said to deliver messages through chosen voices, and the breath of divine inspiration, pneuma, in Greek, found a new home in the language of the Holy Spirit. Perhaps, in some subtle way, the oracle never truly vanished. Her voice simply changed form. In the hush of history, that idea feels almost poetic. The notion that no truth ever truly dies, it only evolves. The oracle's gift was never merely foresight. It was connection, the art of hearing the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the moment. And that art, perhaps, survives wherever faith and mystery meet. As the centuries turned and the world forgot the god's name, Delphi slept under dust and olive trees, her marble bones buried beneath time. But the mountain remained. The wind still moved through the ruins, gentle and low, as if carrying a message across ages. That nothing divine is ever truly lost, only waiting to be rediscovered. Centuries passed, and the world changed beyond recognition. Empires rose and fell, languages evolved, and the gods of Olympus were reduced to myth. Stories whispered by poets and scholars rather than worshipped by kings. Delphi, once the radiant center of prophecy, lay buried beneath earth and time. The temple stones were repurposed for farmhouses. The sacred way became a shepherd's path, and the Castalian spring still flowed, but few remembered its name. Yet history has a strange way of remembering what humans forget. In the 19th century, long after Apollo's last flame had gone cold, the mountain began to stir once more. Not through gods or visions this time, but through the hands of archaeologists and dreamers who sought to uncover what the world had lost. It began with rumors. Travelers who wandered through central Greece in the 1800s spoke of ruins scattered across the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Columns, broken statues, fragments of marble inscriptions. Local villagers called the place Castri, unaware that they were living atop one of the most sacred sites of the ancient world. European explorers, driven by the romantic fever of the age, began to suspect that these stones were more than remnants of some forgotten settlement. They believed and hoped that beneath the modest Greek village lay the bones of Delphi itself. The French, who had been among the first to fall in love with the ruins of antiquity, took special interest. The French school at Athens, founded to study Greek civilization, sent archaeologists to investigate. But the challenge was immense. The village of Castri stood directly over the ancient sanctuary, and its inhabitants had built their homes on Apollo's altar. Excavating the site would mean displacing an entire community, a moral and logistical dilemma. For decades, this problem stalled progress. Scholars debated, politicians hesitated, and the villagers continued to live their quiet lives, unaware that beneath their fields lay one of the greatest secrets of history. Finally, in 1891, after years of negotiation, a bold decision was made. The Greek government and the French school reached an agreement. The entire village of Castri would be relocated to make way for excavation. It was a monumental act of faith in knowledge, in history, in the power of the past to speak again. The villagers were moved to a new settlement nearby, which they named Delphi, in honor of the lost city that had slept beneath their feet. Then, with careful reverence, the digging began. What followed was one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the modern era. As the earth was peeled away, the ancient sanctuary slowly re-emerged, like a memory returning from a long dream. The first marble blocks revealed inscriptions in ancient Greek, dedications to Apollo, records of offerings, fragments of prophecies. Then came the columns, fallen yet graceful, their fluting still sharp despite the centuries. The archaeologists uncovered the temple of Apollo itself, its massive foundation stones still in place, marking the site where the Pythia had once sat. Each day brought new marvels. The treasury of the Athenians, built in gratitude for victory at Marathon. The serpent column, the theater overlooking the valley. The stadium where the Pythian games were held in honor of the god. The walls were inscribed with thousands of names and offerings, echoes of voices long gone. It was as if the mountain had been waiting for humanity to remember it. The earth gave back what it had taken, piece by piece, story by story. Among the most breathtaking finds was the charioteer of Delphi, a bronze statue of haunting beauty, preserved by miracle. When it was unearthed, its eyes of inlaid glass and stone seemed almost alive, staring out at the modern world with serene defiance. The charioteer became a symbol of Delphi's rebirth, a reminder that even in silence, greatness endures. It was art made for a god now reborn for mankind. But the rediscovery of Delphi was more than an archaeological triumph. It was an emotional and philosophical awakening. Scholars who walked among the ruins felt something deeper than mere academic curiosity. There was a strange stillness in the air, a sense that the place was not entirely dead. Some swore they could still smell the faint scent of laurel leaves on the breeze, or hear the whisper of water deep within the stones. Delphi was not just a ruin, it was a resurrection. The discovery reignited fascination with the oracle and her mysteries. Who had she been, truly? How had she spoken? What had she known? And why had her voice fallen silent? Scientists began to study the site with new tools, searching for clues behind the myths. They found that the temple stood over geological faults, where gases, particularly ethylene, may have seeped through fissures in the earth. This, they theorized, could have induced trance-like states in the Pythia, lending a natural explanation to the supernatural. Yet even this scientific answer carried its own mystery. For how could the ancients have known to build their temple precisely where the earth itself breathed out these intoxicating vapors? Was it chance, intuition, or something deeper? A sensitivity to the unseen rhythms of the world that modern man has since forgotten? Delphi, even in explanation, refused to surrender its enigma. As word of the excavation spread, poets, philosophers, and mystics flocked to the site. They came not for data, but for inspiration. To stand in the theater at sunrise, overlooking the valley of Phocis, was to feel a kind of sacred vertigo, the sensation that time itself had folded, that one stood between worlds. Writers described Delphi as a wound in the mountain where the divine once entered. Artists painted the ruins bathed in golden light. Musicians composed hymns to Apollo anew. Delphi had ceased to be a dead city. It had become a symbol of rediscovered wonder. In the decades that followed, Delphi would come to represent more than ancient religion. It would stand as a metaphor for humanity's eternal search for meaning. The oracle, once a woman inhaling the god's breath, became an image of our own inner voice, the quiet intuition that guides us when reason fails. Her silence, broken by excavation, reminded the modern world that not all knowledge comes from machines or measurement. Some truths are whispered through stone, through myth, through memory. And so, as archaeologists brushed dust from marble and deciphered inscriptions, they were not merely uncovering history. They were restoring something sacred, not a god, but the act of listening itself. The same curiosity that had drawn kings to Delphi now stirred within modern hearts. The longing to know what lies beyond the visible, to touch what once felt divine. By the time the French completed their excavation in the early 20th century, Delphi had transformed again, from forgotten ruin to living symbol. The villagers who once farmed its slopes now watched tourists and scholars arrive from around the world. The mountain, silent for nearly 2 millennia, was alive with voices once more. The oracle had returned, not as a woman in trance, but as a question echoing through the ages. What truths lie buried beneath our certainty, waiting to be unearthed? Even today, standing among the ruins as the wind moves through the columns, one can almost feel the presence of something ancient. Not a god, perhaps, but an idea that refuses to die. The stones seem to breathe, the mountain hums softly, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, the old fissure still sighs. The oracle's silence has become its own kind of prophecy, one that speaks not of destiny, but of rediscovery. For every age must find its own way to hear the voice of the divine, and every silence, if we listen closely enough, has something left to say. The rediscovery of Delphi did not simply reopen an ancient ruin. It reopened a question that humanity has been asking since the dawn of time. Where does wisdom come from? The archaeologists had unearthed marble and bronze, inscriptions and temples, but beneath all that lay something far more elusive, the mystery of the oracle herself. Who was she, truly? A priestess channeling divine power, or a woman intoxicated by the breath of the earth? Was her voice the echo of a god, or the brilliance of her own mind shaped by ritual and faith? In the century that followed Delphi's excavation, scientists, historians, and philosophers would each try to answer these questions, and in doing so, they would uncover not just the truth of the oracle, but something profound about humanity itself. The earliest attempts to explain the oracle's power came from skeptics who viewed her as little more than a clever fraud. They argued that the Pythia's trances were performance, a carefully constructed illusion designed to maintain control over superstitious petitioners. They pointed to the temple priests, who recorded and interpreted her words, suggesting they manipulated ambiguous statements to suit political or financial ends. After all, oracles had influence. Kings and city-states paid lavishly for Apollo's favor. Could such a system survive without a hint of manipulation? But others disagreed. The testimonies of ancient writers, from Herodotus to Plutarch, painted a more nuanced picture. They described the Pythia as sincere, trembling, often exhausted by the divine burden she carried. Plutarch, who himself served as a priest at Delphi, wrote that her voice would change in tone and intensity, that she would speak words she did not consciously know, and that her exhaustion after prophecy was genuine. He believed she was indeed filled by the god, though not in the crude, literal sense. To him, Apollo was not a being descending from the heavens, but a force of harmony and truth that temporarily aligned itself with the soul of the oracle. In that sense, the god's voice was her own, the divine working through the human. For centuries, these debates remained philosophical. Then, in the late 20th century, science entered the conversation, and with it came an astonishing revelation. In 2001, a team of geologists led by Gel de Boer and archaeologist John Hale made a discovery that would shake the foundations of both skepticism and faith. Using geological surveys, they found that the Temple of Apollo had been built directly over the intersection of two fault lines. These faults released gases, among them ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon known to induce trance states and euphoria when inhaled in low concentrations. This was no coincidence. The ancients, whether by observation or instinct, had chosen the site with precision. The same fissures that had once been thought purely mythological, the chasm of the god's breath, were real. Ethylene would have risen from the earth, mixing with the incense that filled the Ataton, the inner chamber where the Pythia sat. The gas, in just the right dose, could have caused the oracle's ecstatic states, hallucinations, altered consciousness, even visions. The ancient descriptions suddenly made sense. The sweet fragrance, the trembling, the divine delirium. But this explanation, rather than demystifying Delphi, only deepened its wonder. For how could a civilization 2.5 millennia ago have chosen precisely the spot where the earth itself exhaled this rare and intoxicating vapor? Was it luck, or had the priests somehow recognized the signs? The scent of the air, the behavior of animals, the sensation of energy beneath their feet? It seemed impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. Science had revealed the mechanism but not the mystery. And so a new theory emerged, one that blended geology and spirituality, reason and reverence. The oracle's power, it suggested, came from a union of forces, the natural and the human, the geological and the psychological. The earth provided the setting, but it was the Pythia who transformed that raw energy into meaning. Her training, her belief, her role as a vessel of divine wisdom, all these combined to turn an ordinary woman into the voice of a god. The oracle was not a fraud, nor merely a victim of chemical intoxication. She was a bridge between matter and spirit, between earth and heaven. Historians began to reinterpret her prophecies through this lens. Many of her pronouncements, once dismissed as riddles or manipulations, seemed to carry deep psychological insight. When Croesus, king of Lydia, asked if he should wage war on Persia, the oracle famously replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Croesus assumed it meant Persia's, but it was his own. The brilliance of the statement lay not in its ambiguity, but in its reflection of human blindness. The oracle did not lie. She merely revealed truth in a form the listener was capable of hearing. Modern psychology found resonance in this. The Pythia, in her altered state, might have accessed subconscious wisdom, what Carl Jung would later call the collective unconscious. The god's voice, in this view, was the voice of humanity's deeper mind. The oracle's riddles were not tricks but mirrors, showing each questioner their own truth. In this way, Delphi's mysteries began to feel eerily modern, anticipating both psychotherapy and philosophy by thousands of years. Still, there remains something untamed in the story. Even if we understand the geology, even if we explain the chemistry, there lingers that haunting question. Why does the human soul so desperately long to hear the divine? Why have we, across every age and culture, sought voices beyond our own to guide us? Whether they come from gods, spirits, or the earth itself. Perhaps the oracle's true secret was not her prophecy, but her embodiment of that longing. She stood in the dark, breathed the earth's exhalation, and became the vessel for something greater than herself. As modern visitors walk through the ruins of Delphi today, they often pause at the spot where the Pythia once sat. It is a simple stone circle now, surrounded by fragments of columns and the faint murmur of the wind. There are no vapors, no chants, no laurel leaves burning. And yet, standing there, many feel an undeniable presence. Not of a god, but of history itself, breathing softly through the cracks. The mind begins to wander, to wonder. What would it be like to hear that voice again? What would it say to us now, in an age of noise and certainty? Perhaps that is Delphi's final lesson, that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit. The oracle's power did not lie in prediction, but in perception. She did not simply tell the future. She made people see the consequences of their choices, the fragility of their hopes, the patterns of fate woven around them. In that sense, Apollo's breath still lingers. Every time we pause to listen, truly listen, to the quiet voice within or the signs in the world around us, we reenact Delphi's sacred act. Science may have solved the mechanics of her trance, but the heart of the mystery remains. For whether her visions came from ethylene or eternity, the result was the same. Humanity touched something beyond itself. And perhaps that is what prophecy has always been, the meeting point of wonder and reason, where the mind of man and the breath of the earth briefly become one. Even now, as the sun sets over Mount Parnassus and the last light spills across the ancient stones, one might almost imagine the faint shimmer of heat rising from the ground, the god's breath, eternal and unseen, whispering once more through time. As the 20th century progressed, the fascination with Delphi began to evolve once more. The archaeologists had unearthed its stones, the scientists had explained its vapors, and the historians had pieced together its rituals. Yet something deeper still pulsed beneath the surface. The Oracle of Delphi had become more than an ancient curiosity. She had become a mirror for the modern mind, reflecting our endless search for meaning in an age that had traded faith for fact. The more we studied her, the more we realized she had been studying us all along. Her voice echoing through the ages, challenging every generation to ask, where does truth end and mystery begin? In the early decades of the century, as Europe staggered through wars and revolutions, Delphi became a kind of sanctuary for poets, mystics, and thinkers seeking something pure amid the chaos of modernity. The ruins seemed to hum with an energy that defied logic, a quiet defiance against the industrial world's obsession with progress. Writers like W.B. Yeats, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Nikos Kazantzakis all found inspiration in Delphi's silence. To them, it was not merely an archaeological site but a threshold between worlds, a place where time itself seemed porous. Rilke, visiting the ruins in the 1920s, described it as standing on the edge of breath, as though the mountain still exhaled the soul of the god. For Yeats, who believed in cyclical time and prophetic vision, the oracle represented the last voice of the ancient world before reason silenced myth. In Delphi, he felt the pulse of the eternal feminine, the same archetype that poets and prophets had sought since time began. The voice that speaks truth through mystery. Even psychologists and philosophers began to revisit Delphi's legacy. Carl Jung, whose ideas about the collective unconscious reshaped how we understand myth, saw the oracle as a symbol of humanity's inner dialogue with the divine. In his writings, he often referred to ancient prophecy not as superstition but as a language of the psyche, a way for the human mind to communicate with itself through symbols and archetypes. The Pythia, in her trance, was not a puppet of the gods, but an embodiment of the collective soul, channeling wisdom that transcended individuality. Delphi, in this new light, became less about Apollo and more about humanity's capacity for transcendence. The sacred fissure that had once exhaled intoxicating gases now seemed to represent the rift between the conscious and the unconscious, the place where rational thought meets intuition. The oracle's voice, then, was the voice of that meeting point, the whisper that rises from within when reason alone cannot see the path forward. By mid-century, as the horrors of 2 world wars scarred the Western imagination, many turned back to the wisdom of the ancients for solace. Delphi's story offered something profoundly relevant, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but the search for meaning never dies. The oracle's temple had been reduced to ruins, yet her words still echoed, a testament that truth, however fragile, endures beyond empires. Philosophers saw in her the prototype of all prophets, saints, and visionaries, those rare souls who stand at the boundary of worlds and translate the ineffable into human speech. Then came the age of existentialism, and Delphi found new life once again. Thinkers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre wrestled with meaning in a godless universe, asking questions the oracle herself might have answered in riddles. What is destiny, if not the pattern of our choices? What is prophecy, if not the courage to see clearly what others refuse to? The oracle's world, one of ambiguity, of paradox, of divine irony, seemed eerily aligned with modern uncertainty. Some began to wonder whether the oracle spirit had merely changed form. In an age of psychology, philosophy, and science, prophecy no longer wore the robes of a priestess but the language of the subconscious, the symbolic, the intuitive. Modern oracles emerged, analysts, poets, thinkers, each seeking to interpret the whispers of meaning beneath the surface of life. Delphi had not died. It had evolved into the modern mind's interior temple. Yet there were those who sought a more tangible connection to the ancient site. In the 1960s and 70s, as the counterculture movement embraced mysticism and Eastern spirituality, Delphi once again became a pilgrimage site, not for kings or generals this time, but for seekers. Travelers came from all over the world, drawn by the mountain's mythic aura. Some meditated among the ruins. Others claimed to hear whispers on the wind or see lights flicker near the temple at dusk. The same energy that had enthralled the ancients seemed to hum once more, as though Apollo's spirit had merely been waiting for belief to return. This revival of spiritual curiosity gave rise to new interpretations. Esoteric scholars began to connect Delphi to the concept of geomancy, the belief that certain places on Earth hold natural concentrations of energy, or what Eastern traditions call ley lines. The ancient Greeks, they suggested, may have chosen Delphi not by accident, but by a sensitivity to these invisible currents. The temple's alignment with celestial patterns, its position overlooking the valley, even its relationship to nearby sacred sites, all pointed to a design rooted in a deep, intuitive understanding of the Earth's energy. To some, this suggested that the oracle's divine inspiration was not supernatural at all, but a communion with the planet itself. At the same time, modern historians continued to explore Delphi's political and cultural power. They found that the oracle had been more than a spiritual guide. She had been a force of diplomacy, shaping alliances, wars, and reforms across centuries. Her influence had stretched from Athens to Sparta, from the rise of democracy to the fall of empires. In a sense, she had been the conscience of the ancient world, an invisible hand reminding rulers that power was fleeting, and the gods always watched. This duality, the mystical and the political, the spiritual and the pragmatic, fascinated the modern world. Delphi's story began to appear in literature, film, and art as a metaphor for truth's fragile balance between revelation and manipulation. The oracle became a symbol for the human condition itself. Wise yet fallible, divine yet mortal, speaking truth yet bound by language that can never quite capture it. By the end of the century, Delphi's ruins had become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved not just as a relic of history, but as a shrine to the eternal mystery of human consciousness. Visitors came by the thousands, walking the same sacred path once trod by emperors and philosophers. And though no priestess awaited them at the temple's heart, the silence spoke its own prophecy. The wind through the columns seemed to murmur an ancient truth, that every age must find its own way to listen. Standing there today, beneath the shadow of Mount Parnassus, one can feel the strange paradox of Delphi, both timeless and transient, both ruin and revelation. The stones no longer whisper answers, yet they still ask questions. And perhaps that is the oracle's final, enduring power, to remind us that the search for truth is itself divine. For in every human heart, there remains a fissure like the one beneath her temple, a hidden crack through which mystery breathes, inviting us to listen, to wonder, and to remember that even silence can be a prophecy. In the 21st century, Delphi stands quietly under the Greek sun, its marble bones gleaming pale against the deep green of Mount Parnassus. Tourists wander among the columns, cameras in hand, whispering in awe, though few truly grasp what happened here, what this place once was. They see ruins, not revelation, stone, not spirit. Yet beneath their feet lies something far older and far more alive than they realize, a pulse that has never stopped beating. For Delphi is not dead. It is dreaming, and those who know how to listen still swear they can hear the echo of the oracle's breath in the wind that moves through the ruins at dusk. In recent decades, Delphi has become the focus of a new kind of pilgrimage, not of religion but of curiosity. Scientists, mystics, historians, and wanderers all come here seeking answers to questions that transcend time. What did the oracle really know? What is prophecy, if not a dialogue between the mind and the mysteries of the universe? And perhaps most hauntingly, could the oracle's voice still have something to say to us now? Modern science, paradoxically, has only deepened the mystery. While the 20th century geological studies confirmed the presence of ethylene gas beneath the temple, later analyses found that its concentration was likely too low to cause full hallucination, yet still strong enough to induce subtle, euphoric effects and altered states of awareness. This discovery reawakened an old question. Was the oracle's power simply chemical, or was there something else? Something psychological, environmental, or even quantum at play? Some neuroscientists have proposed that the oracle's trance was not unlike a meditative or flow state, a condition in which the boundaries of the self dissolve, allowing the subconscious to process information with extraordinary speed and clarity. In that sense, the Pythia might not have been seeing the future in a supernatural sense, but rather perceiving patterns, reading the invisible threads of cause and effect that most minds overlook. Her visions may have been the flowering of human intuition at its highest form. This idea that prophecy is a form of hyper-awareness rather than divine possession has fascinated modern thinkers. It suggests that the oracle's gift was not given by the gods but cultivated through ritual, belief, and a deep connection to nature. The laurel leaves, the rhythmic chanting, the rising vapors, all of it created a state of heightened perception. The Pythia, trained in this ancient technology of the soul, became a kind of human antenna, tuning into frequencies most of us can no longer hear. This theory resonates with studies of shamans, mystics, and visionaries across cultures, from the ayahuasqueros of the Amazon to the seers of Tibet. Across time and geography, the pattern is the same. Sacred spaces, altered states, and the pursuit of wisdom that lies just beyond the veil of reason. Could it be that Delphi was part of a universal human technology, a system for accessing the unseen layers of consciousness that modern life has dulled? Anthropologists have begun to see the oracle not as an anomaly but as part of a global continuum, evidence that ancient humanity may have understood more about the mind and the earth than we give them credit for. The ancients saw no division between the physical and the spiritual, between the world and the self. The fissure beneath the temple was not merely geological. It was symbolic, the meeting point of realms. The Pythia sat at the center of that intersection, mediating between earth and sky, body and spirit, science and mystery. And so, the oracle becomes less a figure of myth and more a symbol of balance, a reminder that true wisdom lies not in choosing between faith and reason, but in listening to both. In an age defined by information and noise, Delphi's silence has become its loudest message. It reminds us that there was once a world where knowledge came not from data, but from stillness, from listening deeply to the rhythms of the world. Philosophers of the modern era have taken this symbolism even further. Delphi's famous inscription, Know Thysoten, Know Thyself, carved into the temple entrance, has become the cornerstone of human introspection. What began as a sacred admonition to pilgrims has evolved into the defining commandment of philosophy, psychology, and spirituality. To know oneself, the oracle seemed to say, is to know the universe, for within each of us lies a reflection of the cosmos. In the 21st century, this idea feels more urgent than ever. We live in an age of algorithms and artificial intelligence, where prediction has become a science and prophecy a commodity. Machines can forecast weather, markets, even behavior, and yet, for all our precision, humanity has not grown wiser. We can see patterns in data, but not in ourselves. The oracle's words, her warnings, her riddles, her silences, seem to whisper across time. What use is foresight without understanding? Perhaps that is why Delphi continues to haunt us. Beneath all our progress, we still hunger for meaning, not merely the ability to predict, but the capacity to know. The oracle's gift was never the future itself, but the understanding of how choices echo through it. Her prophecies taught humility, that even when we know, we may not understand, and even when we see, we may not believe. In recent years, psychologists have begun to reframe ancient prophecy as a metaphor for intuition, the mind's mysterious ability to anticipate outcomes without conscious reasoning. Studies in neuroscience have shown that humans can detect complex patterns instinctively, often knowing what will happen moments before it does. Could it be that the oracle's power was the earliest expression of this hidden intelligence? A blending of trance, intuition, and sacred ritual that allowed her to articulate what others only felt. The deeper we look, the more the oracle seems less like an artifact of superstition and more like a glimpse of untapped human potential. In a world that prizes logic and skepticism, she reminds us that not all knowledge comes from the measurable. Some truths, perhaps the most important ones, emerge from the spaces between thought and silence, between breath and belief. Standing at Delphi today, one can see the modern and the ancient coexisting in quiet dialogue. The hum of car engines fades as one ascends the sacred way, replaced by the rustle of olive trees and the whisper of wind through the stones. The temples remains shimmer in the late afternoon light, and if one stands very still, a strange calm settles, as though the mountain itself remembers. In that stillness, the boundaries between centuries dissolve, and the question rises, soft and unbidden. Was the oracle ever truly gone? Or has she been speaking all along, in ways we have forgotten to recognize? Perhaps the Oracle of Delphi was never a woman possessed by a god, nor merely a product of geology. Perhaps she was something deeper, an embodiment of humanity's eternal conversation with the unknown. And if that is true, then every person who listens for truth in silence, who feels wonder in the presence of the world, who dares to question the obvious, carries a spark of Delphi within them. The mountain breathes still, the spring flows on, and somewhere, beneath the stone and soil, the earth remembers the rhythm of a voice that once spoke for gods and men alike. When the modern world began to rediscover Delphi in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the first instinct was to measure, to map, to categorize. Archaeologists from France, Britain, and Greece descended upon the ruins with tools, notebooks, and an unshakable faith in reason. They unearthed columns, temples, inscriptions, and offerings long buried by centuries of silence. But as the marble fragments were lifted back into the light, a strange realization began to settle over those who worked there. The closer they came to uncovering the stones, the further away the mystery itself seemed to drift. The oracle, it appeared, did not yield her secrets so easily. At first, the French excavation teams believed they could reconstruct Delphi as a museum piece, a shrine to rational history rather than divine mystery. They catalogued the treasuries of city-states, traced the foundations of the Temple of Apollo, and identified the theater, the gymnasium, the stadium. But the more they found, the less they understood the pulse that once animated this place. Delphi had been more than stone and ceremony. It had been a conversation between the earth and the human mind, between faith and knowledge. And no amount of excavation could resurrect that dialogue. Still, in their search for the physical oracle, the archaeologists stumbled upon something remarkable. The ruins were not random. Every structure had meaning, every orientation a purpose. The temple aligned not only with celestial paths but with geological fissures beneath the mountain. The theater and the temple stood in deliberate harmony, as though the Greeks had built art and prophecy side by side to reflect the twin powers of beauty and truth. To stand at Delphi was to stand at a crossroads of human experience, where myth became architecture and landscape became scripture. But it wasn't just scholars who returned to Delphi. Mystics, poets, and seekers began to arrive too, drawn not by data but by a sensation, a magnetic pull that defied explanation. They spoke of an energy that seemed to hum through the stones, of dreams that grew unusually vivid after visiting the temple. The air itself, they said, felt alive. Some called it imagination, others called it memory, but many left changed, convinced that something ancient was still breathing here. Among them was the poet Angelos Cyclianos, who in the early 20th century attempted to revive the Delphic festivals, an ambitious effort to restore Delphi not as a ruin, but as a living spiritual center. His vision was part performance, part pilgrimage. Music, theater, and ritual blended into an act of communion with the land. Though the experiment ultimately failed, it rekindled an idea that had lain dormant for centuries, that Delphi's power was not dead, merely sleeping, waiting for those who could approach it not as archaeologists, but as participants in its mystery. As the 20th century unfolded, Delphi transformed again, this time into a mirror for modernity's contradictions. The age of science sought to explain what faith once revered. Geologists discovered the ethylene gas beneath the temple, offering a chemical explanation for the oracle's trances. Psychologists framed her prophecies as manifestations of the subconscious mind. Yet neither explanation diminished the wonder. If anything, they magnified it. What if nature itself had been the oracle's accomplice? What if Apollo's breath had truly been the Earth's? By the 1960s and 70s, the spiritual counterculture found its way to Delphi too. The hippie travelers of the Magical Mystery Tour years wandered through Greece in search of ancient wisdom, drawn to sites like Delphi as symbols of lost harmony. Some meditated among the ruins. Others spoke of seeing visions in the smoke of the incense that still burned at nearby shrines. They were mocked by academics, but one can't help noticing the irony. The seekers of old had done much the same. The only difference was vocabulary. Where the ancients spoke of gods, the moderns spoke of energy. Where the ancients said prophecy, the moderns said intuition. The experience remained timeless and untranslatable. But the question lingered: what, precisely, was the oracle's gift? If we strip away the supernatural, what remains? Historians today argue that the Pythia's prophecies often reflected remarkable insight into political, economic, and psychological realities. The oracle's power may have been her ability to see the truth that others refused to confront. Perhaps, surrounded by ritual and expectation, the Pythia's subconscious was freed to articulate what the collective already knew but dared not admit. Her words, veiled in poetry and ambiguity, became the mirror in which society saw itself most clearly. In this light, the oracle becomes not a mystic, but a voice of conscience, one that transcends time. Every civilization, it seems, produces its own oracles. Prophets, poets, scientists, visionaries. People who, in their own ways, listen deeply and speak truths the world would rather ignore. Delphi, then, is not a relic but a metaphor, a reminder that the search for wisdom is as old as the human soul. In the last few decades, new technologies have brought Delphi to life in ways even the archaeologists could not have imagined. Digital reconstructions now allow us to walk through the sanctuary as it once stood, to hear the chants, to see the smoke rising into the blue Greek sky. Yet even in these simulations, something remains elusive. The digital oracle, rendered in pixels and data, feels hollow without the hum of the mountain, the scent of the laurel, the breath of mystery. Perhaps that is the final lesson Delphi offers to our age of machines, that wisdom cannot be downloaded. Today, as visitors climb the sacred way, most stop at the remains of the Temple of Apollo, take their photographs, and move on. But a few linger. They close their eyes, feel the wind on their face, and let the silence speak. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. Not a voice, perhaps, but a presence. It is not the booming command of a god, nor the hypnotic whisper of a trance, but something subtler. An awareness, a recognition, a sense that this place once held a dialogue between humanity and the infinite. Standing there, it is impossible not to wonder. If the oracle were alive today, what would she say? Would she speak of the climate unraveling, the technology dividing us, the world teetering between knowledge and madness? Would she warn us, as she once warned kings, that power without wisdom is ruin? Or would she simply repeat the same 3 words carved in stone above her temple? Know thyself, as if to say that the answers we seek have always been within us? Delphi, in its ruins, still invites that question. The marble may be broken, the prophecies long silenced, but the dialogue continues, between the past and the present, between the seeker and the mountain. The oracle's voice, though no longer human, still reverberates in the air that moves through the valley, in the echo of footsteps on the sacred way, in the breath of every person who dares to listen. Perhaps that is her truest prophecy, that the search for meaning never ends, and that every generation must find its own way to hear the voice beneath the noise. The oracle's words were never just about the future. They were about reflection. For to understand what is coming, one must first understand what is within. There is a strange paradox in the story of the Oracle of Delphi, that her voice, though silenced more than 16 centuries ago, seems louder now than ever. She is no longer a living woman seated above a fissure, breathing the vapors of the earth. Yet her shadow drifts through our culture in ways we barely notice. In films and novels, in political rhetoric and scientific pursuit, the concept of prophecy persists, reshaped, redefined, but never forgotten. It is as if humanity cannot bear to live without some whisper of foresight, some echo of the divine that once spoke through the Pythia's trembling lips. Delphi, in death, has become a mirror reflecting not what we were, but what we still long to be. When the ancient rituals ended and the temple fell silent, Delphi did not vanish from the imagination of mankind. During the Christian era, it was condemned as the haunt of demons. Medieval writers told tales of a dragon slumbering beneath its ruins. To the Renaissance thinkers, it became a symbol of lost wisdom, of truths smothered by time. By the Enlightenment, philosophers saw it as the birthplace of rational inquiry, an ironic twist for a site once devoted to mystic visions. And in our own time, Delphi stands as a riddle once more. Was it madness, science, or something that defies both? Each age remakes the oracle in its own image, trying to coax her secret from the dust. In the age of data and algorithms, prophecy has migrated from the temple to the machine. The priests of Apollo have been replaced by scientists and programmers who read not the flight of birds or the tremor of the earth, but the flow of information. Supercomputers now forecast the weather, the stock market, even patterns of human behavior. Artificial intelligence models can anticipate what we will say before we say it, what we will buy before we desire it. And yet, for all their precision, these new oracles are missing something essential. They can predict, but they cannot understand. They calculate, but they do not feel. They can model the world, but they cannot touch its mystery. This disquiet, this haunting sense that something vital has been lost, is what draws so many back to Delphi. In a world drowning in information, the oracle represents a deeper kind of knowing, one that transcends mere data. Her prophecies were not answers. They were invitations to reflection. When Croesus asked if he should go to war, the oracle told him that if he crossed the river, he would destroy a great empire, but she never said which empire. It was left to him to interpret, to confront his own hubris. That was the true genius of Delphi. It forced those who sought knowledge to confront themselves. In our own era of algorithmic certainty, that kind of wisdom feels almost revolutionary. There is a quiet movement growing among philosophers, scientists, and artists who believe that ancient sites like Delphi still hold lessons for modern thought. They call it re-enchantment, the idea that humanity must recover its sense of wonder, its sacred relationship with the world. They argue that reason alone is not enough, that without awe, without reverence, knowledge becomes sterile, even dangerous. The oracle's world, they suggest, was one in which mystery and intellect coexisted, a balance we have lost. Perhaps that is why, in a strange twist of fate, Even physicists and mathematicians now use language that sounds eerily spiritual. Quantum theory speaks of uncertainty, entanglement, and hidden connections, concepts the priests of Apollo might have understood in their own symbolic way. Standing at Delphi, one senses that connection still. The mountain air carries a vibration, subtle but unmistakable. The ruins seem to hum with memory. Modern visitors describe it as a feeling of weightlessness, of perspective, as if time folds upon itself. The Oracle's sanctuary may have been built upon a geological fault, but perhaps that was never an accident. The ancients understood that places of power are not random. They are chosen because they vibrate with the rhythm of the earth. The fissure beneath the temple was not just a physical feature. It was a metaphor for the crack between worlds, the thin place where spirit and matter meet. The scientists who study Delphi today sometimes speak in tones that sound suspiciously poetic. They talk about geomagnetic anomalies, atmospheric ions, the acoustics of stone amphitheaters. Yet even as they explain, their voices soften. There is an unspoken reverence in the way they describe the site, as though they know they are standing in a place that transcends their instruments. Rationally, they can map every inch of the ground, but emotionally, they know they are treading on the threshold of something older than reason itself. One archaeologist once confessed, after years of work at Delphi, that he could no longer visit the temple without feeling as though he were being watched. Not in fear, but in awareness. "It is as if the mountain sees you," he said. "As if the earth remembers everyone who has stood here." In his words lies the truth that the ancients already knew. Delphi was not just a place to speak to the gods. It was a place where the world itself became conscious. And yet, there is a melancholy woven into Delphi's story, the tragedy of all knowledge that becomes forgotten, of all wisdom reduced to ruins. The last Pythia's voice faded not because humanity no longer needed her, but because we stopped listening. The Christian emperors silenced her temples. The modern world silenced the spaces within ourselves that once heard such voices. But perhaps the oracle's greatest prophecy was that she would never truly vanish. That one day, when the noise of civilization became unbearable, we would return, not to worship but to remember. In that sense, every person who seeks meaning in an age of chaos is part of Delphi's rebirth. The scientists searching for the origins of consciousness, the poets seeking language for wonder, the mystics meditating on the breadth of the world, all are heirs to the oracle's legacy. Delphi's wisdom was never about predicting the future. It was about aligning with the pulse of existence itself. To know the future, the oracle might say, you must first understand how the present breathes. Imagine, then, the mountain as it stands today. The sun lowering behind Parnassus, the ruins awash in gold. A tourist bends to tie her shoe near the temple's foundation, and as she looks up, for a fleeting second, the light strikes the marble just so, and she swears she sees a figure in white, veiled in smoke, standing where the tripod once stood. She blinks and the vision is gone. She laughs it off, tells herself it was a trick of light. But something inside her stirs, a feeling not of fear, but of recognition, as though she has momentarily remembered a language her soul once spoke. Perhaps that is Delphi's true gift in our time. Not the promise of prophecy, but the restoration of mystery. In a world that believes it can measure everything, Delphi reminds us that the most important truths cannot be quantified. They must be felt. They must be lived. The Oracle of Delphi may no longer breathe the vapors of the earth, but she has found new ways to speak. In the tremor of intuition, in the patterns of dreams, in the quiet voice that tells us when something is true before we can prove it. Her temple lies in ruins, but her spirit has migrated into us. And perhaps that was her final prophecy all along, that humanity itself would one day become the oracle, forever searching for the balance between knowledge and wonder, between the mind's reason and the soul's longing to believe. There are stories that claim the oracle's final prophecy, spoken just before the sanctuary fell silent, was not of war or kings, but of herself. "Tell them," she is said to have whispered, "that the temple has fallen and that Apollo no longer speaks." Whether these words were ever truly uttered, no one can know. Yet the image endures. A woman, seated in the fading light of her temple, breathing her last vision into the world before the silence of centuries descends. In that single moment, history itself seemed to exhale, the ancient gods retreating, the age of myth giving way to the age of men. The end of the oracle was not sudden but slow, as though time itself hesitated to erase her. Even after Emperor Theodosius decreed the closure of all pagan sanctuaries in 393 CE, whispers lingered in the valleys around Parnassus. Local shepherds still left offerings near the Castalian spring. Travelers spoke of strange dreams and voices in the wind. For a generation, perhaps two, the old faith refused to die completely. It is easy to imagine an aging priestess sitting among the crumbling stones, speaking softly to the empty air, unwilling to believe that the God she had served had vanished. But time, relentless as ever, moved on. Christianity spread through Greece, and the once sacred precinct of Delphi became a quarry for new churches and homes. The marble of Apollo's temple was repurposed to build walls and chapels, as if the divine had been fragmented and scattered into the everyday. The voice that had once guided empires was reduced to silence, buried under centuries of dust and forgetting. Yet even then, something about Delphi resisted disappearance. Travelers continued to write about the place, sensing an atmosphere that could not be explained. A sacred residue, a presence that refused to fade. When medieval monks passed through the region, they described the ruins as haunted. They claimed that strange lights flickered among the stones at night, and that the mountain sometimes trembled, as if remembering its ancient voice. The Christians called it the echo of demons, but perhaps it was only the earth sighing, the last breaths of an ancient dialogue between humanity and the divine. Over time, the name Delphi itself came to mean mystery, a place where the boundaries between worlds had once grown thin. It would take more than 1,000 years before the oracle's memory began to awaken again. Renaissance scholars rediscovered the texts of Plutarch and Herodotus, reading their accounts of the Pythia with a mixture of skepticism and longing. Artists painted her as a symbol of lost truth, a woman poised between madness and divinity, her eyes open to things no mortal should see. To them, she was not just a relic of pagan superstition, but a metaphor for inspiration itself. The poet's vision, the scientist's insight, the artist's flash of genius, all of it, they believed, was a kind of prophecy. The oracle had simply been its most visible vessel. By the 18th century, travelers on the Grand Tour began visiting Delphi once again. They found a small village called Castri built directly over the ruins of the sanctuary, its houses perched upon the very stones that had once supported the temple. The villagers told tales of strange accidents, of foundations that collapsed without warning. They said the ground was restless. And indeed, when archaeologists finally arrived in the 19th century and relocated the village, they discovered that the modern homes had been standing on top of sacred ground, a literal layering of the living world upon the buried memory of the gods. It was as if the oracle had never left, merely waiting beneath the dust. And when the first marble fragments were lifted from the soil, Delphi seemed to breathe again. The inscriptions, the treasuries, the votive statues, all whispered fragments of her lost language. Slowly, the outlines of her sanctuary returned, and with it, the echo of her voice. Even now, standing among those reconstructed ruins, one can almost hear her. Not in words, but in feeling. The wind moves through the columns like breath, and the stones shimmer with a strange vitality. The silence of Delphi is not empty. It hums with centuries of questions. What did she truly see? Did she ever doubt herself? Did she ever wish to be free of the god's command? These questions will never be answered, and perhaps that is the point. The oracle's greatest power was not in her predictions, but in her mystery. Every civilization, sooner or later, must face its own silence, the moment when its certainties dissolve and its gods go quiet. For the Greeks, that silence was Delphi. For us, it may be something else, the silence that follows too much noise, the stillness after too much knowledge. And perhaps, just as the ancients once climbed the mountain to ask their questions, we too are still searching for that place where the world listens back. Delphi may be ruins now, but her story remains alive, a whisper carried on the wind, a riddle that refuses to die. For as long as humanity continues to wonder, to dream, and to seek the truth within the unknown. The oracle's silence will not be the end of her voice. It will be its echo. As night falls over Delphi, the ruins seem to shift beneath the stars. The temple stones glow faintly in the moonlight, and the valley below sinks into silence, as if the earth itself is listening. The air is cool and heavy with memory. Somewhere beyond the reach of sight, an owl cries, the same sound, perhaps, that once echoed through these hills when kings knelt before the oracle, trembling with fear and hope. In that quiet, one feels an almost electric awareness, the sense that time has folded in on itself, and that for an instant the past and present coexist. The questions that once filled the air here, of destiny, of truth, of meaning, have never really vanished. They still hover in the darkness, waiting to be asked again. Perhaps prophecy was never about seeing the future at all. Perhaps it was always about learning how to listen, to the earth, to silence, to the secret voice within every human heart that still remembers what the oracle once knew. In the centuries that followed, Delphi's stones were repurposed, its temple dismantled, and its name nearly erased. Yet the essence of the oracle seemed to seep into the bloodstream of history. Her voice, though silenced, found new forms, in the philosophers who questioned, in the mystics who dreamed, in the scientists who sought patterns within chaos. Every great mind that dared to ask why was, in some quiet way, continuing her work. The oracle's spirit survived not through preservation, but through transformation. Her temple became every place where truth was pursued, every moment when a human being looked into the unknown and asked for meaning. Even religions that condemned pagan prophecy could not escape its allure. The early Christian fathers denounced the Pythia as a tool of demons, yet their own mystics spoke of divine ecstasy and revelation with strikingly similar language. Monks entered caves to seek visions. Saints heard voices in solitude. The methods changed, but the yearning remained the same. Humanity could not unlearn its hunger for the sacred voice. It had simply changed the name of the god it addressed. And so, Delphi endures not just as a ruin of marble and myth, but as a symbol of the eternal search for insight. Its story reminds us that prophecy was never about seeing the future. It was about listening deeply to the present. The ancients built their sanctuary around a fissure in the earth, but perhaps that fissure was only a metaphor, a reminder that wisdom lives in the cracks, in the spaces where certainty breaks. We are all standing at the edge of that same abyss, waiting, as they once did, for the whisper that reveals not what will happen, but who we truly are. Night settles completely over Delphi, and the ruins fade into shadow. The stars blaze above like fragments of a broken crown, scattered across the heavens. Somewhere down in the valley, the faint sound of water can still be heard. The Castalian spring, flowing endlessly through centuries, whispering to those who listen closely enough. It is easy, standing there, to feel that time has folded in on itself, that the Pythia might still be somewhere near, waiting, her breath mingling with the wind, her words hovering just beyond comprehension. Delphi no longer speaks through smoke and trance, yet the silence it leaves behind feels heavier, more eloquent than any voice. Perhaps that is the oracle's final gift, to teach us that revelation does not always come as thunder or flame, but sometimes as quiet recognition, a soft knowing that dawns in the heart rather than the ear. The ancients sought certainty, but the oracle offered them something greater, awareness. Her answers were riddles because life itself is one. To understand the riddle was to participate in the divine mystery, to glimpse that truth is not a destination, but a conversation between the world and the soul. As the first light of morning breaks over Mount Parnassus, Delphi glows gold once more. The stones warm beneath the sun, and the silence lifts like mist. The age of prophecy is gone, but the need for wonder remains. And maybe that is where the oracle still lives, not in marble ruins or forgotten rites, but in every human moment of awe, in every heart that dares to ask questions the mind cannot answer. The future she foresaw was not the rise or fall of empires, but this, a world still listening, still seeking, still waiting for the echo of the divine within itself. When the sun finally rises high above Delphi, the mountains reveal their full majesty. Endless folds of green and silver, streaked with the pale bones of marble ruins. The temple stands quiet now, reduced to columns and fragments, yet it seems somehow alive, breathing through the wind that sweeps down from Parnassus. Travelers who arrive here often say they expected to see history. Instead, they feel presence. There's something in the air, an invisible gravity of memory that draws the spirit inward. It's as though the oracle's last prophecy was never spoken aloud, but left suspended in the stillness, waiting for each visitor to discover it for themselves. Over the years, pilgrims, poets, and wanderers have all written about the strange peace of Delphi. Some describe it as sacred, others as unsettling. One modern philosopher called it the silence that thinks. Perhaps that's what the ancients meant when they called it the navel of the world, not a center of geography but of consciousness. Here, thought seems to turn back upon itself, reflecting endlessly, until one begins to glimpse the fine thread that connects all things. Gods and men, earth and sky, knowledge and mystery. Delphi's ruins are not a reminder of what was lost, but of what endures. The marble may crumble, the inscriptions fade, but the questions remain. Eternal, luminous, alive. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we serve beyond ourselves? These were the same questions once whispered to the Pythia, and they still echo today, in every human searching for purpose. Perhaps that is the true meaning of prophecy, not foretelling the path ahead, but awakening the part of us brave enough to walk it. As the camera drifts away from Delphi, the ruins shrink beneath the vast Greek sky, and the voice of the wind becomes the only sound. Somewhere among those stones, once gilded in sunlight and echoing with prayer, humanity learned to listen, not to gods beyond the clouds, but to the quiet wisdom within. The oracle's voice may have faded, but her truth remains eternal. Every question we ask shapes the world we live in. The future is not written in stars or smoke. It waits in our choices, our courage, and our silence between breaths. Delphi still speaks, if we dare to hear.